Well, welcome and good morning. I'm University of Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason. So glad to have you here for this Conservation Cropping Seminar 2022. A couple of things to keep in mind. We are glad that you're here. However, we prefer that you keep your video or your camera off, please. That'll save a lot of bandwidth for us, and make sure that you have your mic on mute. That'll make sure that everybody won't hear what you're doing in your home office or wherever you happen to be today. That'll be great. We're just really, really glad to have you with us. Next slide, please. We would like to take some time to thank the folks that help us out with this as well. We've already talked about that. They include the Nrcs from the United States Department of Agriculture, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, along with the Champaign County Soil and Water Conservation Districts, the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, the Illinois Stewardship Alliance, the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership, American Farmland Trust, Sea Grant, Extension, Pro Harvest Seeds, and of course, the Illinois Department of Agriculture. They are all our partners and sponsors for this 2022 cropping seminar. Next slide, please. We do appreciate you being with us for the day. We would like to welcome our first presenter for the morning, and she's here just to welcome you. In fact, Jackie Byam is here with us for the day. Jackie is the NRCS Deputy State Conservationist here in Champaign. She's worked for the agency for about 17 years. And she just returned from a detail up in South Dakota where she served as the state conservationist for about 120 days after a recent retirement. Now, she began her NRCS career back in 2001 as an intermittent employee in Minnesota while attending college. After graduation, she was selected as a soil conservation technician and progressed to soil conservationist and Farm Bill specialist in various locations across Minnesota. In 2016, Byam accepted the assistant state conservationist for programs in Annapolis, Maryland. And then in June of this past year, she became the deputy state conservationist in Champaign, Illinois. She's a native of southern Minnesota and grew up on a small family farm raising hogs, corn, and soybeans. And she earned a Bachelor of Science in Conservation from the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. Jackie Byam, thank you so much for being with us this morning to kick off our conservation cropping seminar. We appreciate you taking the time with us today.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the introduction, Todd. It's great to be back in the Midwest after a few years out on the East Coast. Really glad to be back in my home region with that. So good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to kick off the 2022 Conservation Cropping Seminar. So while we all wish we could be together today in person, with the storm that's still moving through the area, I think this is one of those rare occurrences where being virtual worked in our favor. But I do have to say that based on last year's numbers and the numbers that I'm seeing on this call right now today, doing these virtually has been very successful. The pandemic has provided us anything, is that we have found new, valuable, efficient, and powerful ways to reach our farmers and decision makers and share information and ideas to make conservation a key part of our operations. I sincerely want to thank all of the partners who work together to make this event happen. We'll hear from them after the speakers and presentations are wrapped up, so please stick around to hear their messages. Thank you all for always doing such a great job. We have some quality information for you today. It's helpful, practical, and I believe all of it will work well here in Illinois and on your farms. It's so great to be able to hear from our own Illinois farmers who are successfully using these ideas and who are excited and eager to share their stories with you and answer your questions. Today, we'll have 3 farmers from the northern, central, and southern parts of Illinois to share with us what they've learned and why they do it. The keynote speaker this morning is a farmer from South Carolina. Even though his soils and weather systems are clearly not like ours here in Illinois, I think you'll find his first-generation farmer's journey and what he's doing to be very impressive and inspirational. I look forward to the lineup today and feel confident that this is a good use of your time. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope today's speakers spark a little something in each of you. Thanks, Todd. Back to you.
Hey, thank you, Jackie. We do appreciate you taking time with us. Jackie Byam is the deputy conservationist here in the state of Illinois. Let's move on. We'll start today with our first speaker on systems approaches to soil health, Russell Hedrick. He's a first-generation farmer in the foothills of Hickory, North Carolina, at JRH Grain Farm. Now, Russell is known as one of the most progressive young farmers in the country. He's been featured in Top Producer Magazine, Furrow Magazine, and RFT TV, Ag PhD, and National No-Till Farmer for profitably farming by reducing fertilizer inputs and using soil health practices on cash crops. In 2017, Russell won the North Carolina Corn Yield Contest, the first person to win it in the state using regenerative practices. And Russell's operation focuses on maximizing profits and direct-to-consumer marketing for all of their products, including corn, soybeans, wheat, barley, pastured beef, and pork. He is the founder of Farmers Reserve Distillery, a co-founder of Regen Mills and Heritage Ground, along with co-owner of Soil Regen, and has partnered with Foothills Distillery, producing the first bourbon in North Carolina since Prohibition. Russell, thank you so much. I'd like to knock one back with you at some point, but we'll have to save that for later. We sure are glad that you could join us from your area of the nation. The weather there has been cold, I assume.
Yes, it's been very cold here, and Todd, I want to say I appreciate y'all having me here today, and hopefully the message is received well. But we'll definitely have to get together sometime. Anybody that sees me at a conference knows we travel with samples. So here's a little bit of information about our farm. We started JRH Grain Farms in 2012. That was our first cropping year. We started with 30 acres of corn production that year. And we continue to try to expand the farm every year that we can. So we do operate the farm and several other businesses. That's, a lot of the people that mentored me into our farming operation really helped me understand that vertical integration. Even though, selling sometimes direct to consumers can be a little difficult, really for maximizing our time and investment and really trying to see as much capture of that return as we can, really does come from these value added markets that we can utilize our grain in. So to give you an idea where we live, we're here in North Carolina. We're about an hour above Charlotte, and we're about an hour below Asheville. My home county is Catawba County. So we're typically, foothills on the western side. And then as we leave Catawba County and then where we farm in Iredell, just east of us, we really start getting into those Piedmont type clays. So where my farming operation or farming ideas really started from, I'm first generation, but my grandfather used to make hay and had probably 10, 15 cows. And I would say I was his tractor buddy. I used to ride on the footboard of some old Ford tractors making hay, and that really kind of piqued my interest into agriculture. So that's where it started. Started raising livestock, I think when I was about 5 or 6 years old, started raising goats, and then about 10 or 11 switched over, started raising cattle as well. Had a few cows mixed in with his herd, and it kind of gave us a good understanding of animal management. So when we started in 2012, we had soil erosion issues and winter wheat issues. The first farm that we leased, this is a picture of that farm. I just happened to go to a local soil and water office and was talking to our local soil and water technicians. And this guy I met named Lee Holcomb, who was an Nrcs DC, kind of poked his head out the hall, and he was like, hey, can I tell you about cover crops and what Nrcs does? And really it started organically like that. And so Lee showed me a video called Undercover Farmers that Buzz Clute and the USDA had just put together. And it really featured farmers from North Carolina all the way up to, Jay Fuhrer, David Brandt, a lot of these farmers that have been doing it for a long time. And it gave us the confidence to plant cover. So this is what our first cover crop looked like. And to look at something like that, all our neighbors said we wouldn't be able to plant into it. There would be too many issues, too much residue, green bridge, so many things that we learned about of why it wouldn't work. We planted a crop into this. Our county average on corn is 118 bushels. On a high year, most years it's 80 to 90, but that year we made 197 bushel corn, really focusing on, soil health components that we didn't even really understand at the time. So it's grown from there. So one of the key things that we do as farmers, and a farmer on, farming our operation is taking residue. We like to do biomass samples. We measure a 2 foot by 3 foot area. We take that sample and we dry it out on a trailer. We send it in for at Region Ag Labs now to do total nutrient analysis on it. How much NP and K, sulfur, what kind of fertility are we getting from that cover crop that we can take a credit into our following cash crop. And that really has helped us. One of the big goals that we've seen is balancing that carbon to nitrogen ratio. We do grow some pretty big cover crops being here in the South, but anytime we're seeing that carbon to nitrogen ratio over 40 to 1, we typically do not see a full nutrient release that year. So, if you are a farmer and you're utilizing cover crops, if you're letting them get some growth on them or any kind of biomass, pay attention to that carbon to nitrogen ratio so that we're not tying nutrients up. Not unless that's your goal, but typically for us in a corn crop, we're not trying to tie those nutrients up. So what have we seen for changes? When I first started farming, we pulled a state sample, sent it to the state lab, and used a Melick 3. We started learning about the Haney soil sample in 2013. That's the first year that we pulled those samples. And so we still pull a conventional test and a Haney test just to be able to compare the two on our farm. But from 2013 to 2020, we saw our CO2 respirations, our biological activity increased by over 600%, almost 700. Our WEOC, which is the water extractable carbon source, that is the food source for our biology, we've seen it increase almost 500%. And so the picture on your left, that's the soils that I start farming. We do not have very good cropping soils inherently here in our area. It does take time and management to get them into a system that does produce well. We pay attention to our carbon capture, how much we're seeing increases in carbon content. And so this is what our soils look like now. The farm that we first purchased this will be our 10th cropping season coming up this year. But to see that amount of change from an orange or red type high iron content clay to now it looks almost like chocolate cake. It's very aggregated. Our water infiltration is absolutely through the roof compared to where we started, where we set our baselines in 2012. It really has changed our operation to maximize our resources while cutting back on our inputs and our input cost. So one of the ways we do that is, we talk about setting baselines. This is a picture. Ray Archuleta came out to the farm. We pulled, we dug a foot by foot. We did earthworm counts. On this farm here, I think our earthworm count was somewhere around 3 million earthworms in the top acre foot. We did pentrometer readings to check for compaction layers, infiltration tests to see what our water infiltration, is now versus when we started. Our initial water infiltration rates on our soils were about a 1/2 inch an hour. After being in the system that we're using now, we're typically between 5 to 10 inches an hour now. And to be able to capture that rainfall when we get it is pretty critical, because in North Carolina, the old saying goes is we're about 10 days away from a drought. So having a higher organic matter content and having a higher water availability really does help us, limit the amount of stress that we're seeing on our farms. So when we started working with Lee Holcomb at the NRCS, one of the big things that Lee told us about was check strips. I hate planting them now or leaving them out. It's typically, our weediest areas of the field that we have to spray. It doesn't yield quite as well. But for the sake of us understanding the practices that we're changing on our operation, simply leaving these check strips really does give us a really, visual indicator as a farmer to what we would have been farming like our neighbors versus what we're doing with these cover crops and our management strategies. So you can see that same check strip fairly easy. Our cover crops that we're utilizing to, reduce Johnson grass, pigweed, palmer, morning glories, cuckleburs. There's so many weeds that we were spraying chemicals for that we've cut chemical passes out or reduced chemicals on our operation, that it's well worth the financial cost of the cover crop simply based on the chemical alone. And so this is just a picture of what that same bean field looks like. That would be me standing in that check strip area and simply taking a picture down the field. You can see, the small grain rolled down. At this point in the season, most of the legume cover crops are already broken down, the clovers and vetches. And so it's kind of hard to see them, but that residue mat really does keep our weeds out of our fields. Typically now most of our fields, we don't have to do post applications. If we get a real wet spring and cover crops flood out, or if we have an issue with cover crop stand, we still have to spray those fields. But I would say about 85% of our operation, we've been able to completely remove the chemical post on those fields. And so that brings us to, this past season for 2021, we've really focused on our soybean management, corn, our row crop management. And so as we've learned more about our beans, we've changed up some of the techniques on our farms. We've started paying attention to the varieties we plant, critical daylight and how that influences our essentially our indeterminate soybeans that we plant full season. But this is a picture of one of our fields. That's my truck hood. Those beans absolutely looked amazing this year. We had good weather when we needed it. Didn't have too long of a dry spell this summer. We went out, started doing some scouting, seeing how our beans were going to look. The extension entered us into the state soybean contest this year on a few of our farms, and this one right here ended up setting a new state record. We went out. This is a picture of our day of harvest when extension was out there. We set off our plot. They measured it out for us, and we ended up with a new state record of 117.1 bushels of dryland soybeans. As we see organic matter increase, this farm here, I think when we started farming it was around maybe 1.5% to 2% organic matter. Now we're pushing that 4.5% to 5% organic matter just by changing up some of our crop timing, planting, a few more days earlier on our corn varieties, changing up our beans instead of planting such a late group beans. Being able to get cover crops established at a timely manner has really helped this farm really come around the last 7-8 years. So one of the new things that we started utilizing on our operation as well was sugars. I know it's starting to become more of a talking point among farmers of, how do sugars influence, crop growth? We did it for insects. I met Dr. Jonathan Lundgren back in 2014, and he explained to us how bugs don't have a pancreas, so they can't process complex sugars, and it really does help with our pest management, just keeping that Brix level above 14. It's been a correlation to yield. We've seen more on the yield side on soybeans than we have for corn. But this past season, we had a lot of issues with stink bugs, kudzu bugs. A lot of our neighbors were spraying, 2 or 3 times for insecticide passes. We didn't have to spray any insecticides. We were able to utilize a product like a sugar that we're able to deter those pest insects, but it doesn't affect our beneficials that we're trying to get onto the farms as well. So how do we do that? I think we spent $40 to $60 for a cheap refractometer on Amazon. We've played around with different products like molasses. Molasses did get us over the threshold of 14. But that's not going to stay there for very long as we see more vegetation growth. So we try to get this Brix level as high as we can so that as that plant continues to grow, that gives us a longer control time until we would potentially have to spray again if we still had a pest issue in the area. So then we talked about, our moisture. Typically in our area, everybody is, I would say, somewhat no-till. I would say there's probably 25% conventional tillage. Most farmers, another 25% still run vertical tillage. This is one of our neighbors' farms. We went into a D4 drought a couple years back. I kept being kind of discouraged because there wasn't a massive influence or change between what my neighbors were yielding and what we were yielding. But Lee kept telling me, wait till a dry year, wait until we get a year when we need moisture, it'll really start to show a difference. So our neighbor's corn here, this is taken around July the 4th, July the 5th. That corn had started tasseling out at about waist high. It was just that dry, that hot that year. We went out and took some photos. And so on their bare ground, we were running about 94 degrees in the morning for soil temperatures, which is just absolutely cooking the moisture out of it. And so our county average in that year was about 9 bushels. I think their farm average was about 5 to 9 bushels. In that same year, what really got our neighbors' attention, having these healthier soils with higher water holding capacities and keeping that ground covered. This is a picture and a video of what our planter system looks like. We used to have to roll in a secondary pass. We've integrated some Yetter stalk devastators on the front of the corn planter. We're able to plant and roll in one single pass and really keep that residue pushed down onto the ground and really keep those ground temperatures down pretty well. We didn't have to do any modifications. This system that we used, we simply bought them and bolted them directly onto the planter bar. And we've been using these now for, I think this will be the 5th or 6th season coming up. The only modifications we made to the old system, we did weld the rebar together so that we were getting the rebar all the way across. Now we've upgraded, they've got a new chevron pattern roller that we've upgraded to now, and that really seems to help with our termination. We also changed up our fertility management on our farm. We don't broadcast phosphorus anymore. With some of the sloping hills we have, and we don't want to put phosphorus on top of the ground and see any runoff or any leach. So we actually went to a 2x2 system. We started working with Dr. Rick Kaesebier when he was still at the ARS in Temple, Texas, and really understanding banding that phosphorus. How much could we cut back? What was our efficiency rating going up to? We don't have the grounds to be able to do strip tillage. So there's no way for us to place a dry through that system here, but we were able to do it with this liquid system on the backside of the planter, and that really does cut down on another pass. We're able to do it all at one time. And so we got our corn crop planted, the year of the drought. This is a picture of what it's coming up into, full ground coverage with a cover crop. And same day when we took that picture, our ground temperatures middle of July was 77 degrees versus our neighbors were at 95. And this is the difference between our corn crop and them. Our farm average ended up being about 128 bushels that year. We only had 4 inches of precipitation from March to September. And then we started looking at how do soil health practices influence our grain crops? We do a lot of testing with NC State and the University of Georgia. One of the plots that we put together was if we did cover crops. So the corn on your right had a 7-way cover crop mix, and we did livestock integration. And I do understand, there's farms that we have that we don't have the infrastructure to put livestock on. I don't preach to the crowd that you have to have livestock to change your farm ground, but I have seen personally on my farm that it does help. So where we can integrate livestock, we do. So we did a 7-way cover crop mix, introduced livestock onto it. The other side was simply no-till, which is what our extension has helped with, work with for the last 20, 30 years is pushing farmers to no-till. But without the cover crops and the other systems, no-till I just don't think it works around here like it should. So we planted the same day. It's the same variety, same management systems. We went out there and simply grabbed from the two plots and bent these ears in. And so look at the difference in these two corn varieties. The corn variety on the left had a 56, 57 pound test weight. It would have been standard for what you would see for our area. The one on the right, you can visually see a color difference in it. They tested it for higher, vitamins and nutrients, beta carotenes. We did see higher nutrient content in that corn. One of the key things was that test weight was about 63 to 64 pounds. The yield was better. And so that really, utilizing these plots and working with the universities really does give us a lot of valuable information on what we can achieve on our farm. And that kind of takes us to data. Data is only good as you can understand it. I talk a lot about the Haney test because that is the key test that we use on our farm. We consult with other farmers that use Olson and Bray, Millick. But at the same time, if you're pulling a soil sample and you can't understand the data and interpret it to a way that you can function with it on your operation, what good is it? So if you're working with new soil tests, if you try something new, like I said before, we still pull a Millick 3 and we still pull our Haney test, and it gives us a way to compare what we're doing versus what we would have done. It gives us a way to look at our change on our inputs and investment into the farm. And it really does kind of get, it makes the whole story. So, this year with chemical prices being up about 400% plus, fertilizer being, 2 to 3 times higher. Finally, it seems like a lot of farmers are looking at cover crops and soil health. Don't know how the chemical companies feel about that, but this is probably one of the funnier memes I'd seen, come out since we've seen some of the inflation in our inputs coming for this first farming season. So this is a picture of what we typically see on our Millick 3 test. It takes no account for nitrogen that we've already got. One of the things that really made sense to me when I talked with Dr. Rick Haney, the Haney test uses what they call a H3A extract. It's essentially water and root exudates versus the Millick 3 using something caustic almost as bad as a hydrochloric acid. And what Rick's statement was to me was, does it rain hydrochloric acid on your farm or does it rain water? That really, gave me an understanding of the context of some of these samples that we're pulling. We could be undershooting what's there. We could be overshooting what's there. It really just depends on, which test you use and what extraction method they do. And so then we started working with NC State. One of the big things that we talk to farmers about is, how deep do you pull your soil samples? I was told in no-till only to pull them 4 inches deep, and if we were conventional tillage, go 8 inches deep. That makes no sense to me. Maybe being a first-generation farmer, I haven't heard these things, but I don't farm in a flower pot. My corn roots go down 2 to 3 feet deep. I know water table can affect that depending on where you farm at in this country, but we started pulling samples on most of our farms. We have sample analysis all the way down to 3 feet now. We pay attention and base our fertility recommendations on a 0 to 12 or a 0 to 18, depending on the soil type. But, looking at our report here, if you look at what this report shows, potassium in that 0 to 4 only showed 103 pounds. And based on our soil recommendations from our state, they would have told me to apply fertilizer. But in the 4 to 8, we had another 57 pounds, and the 8 to 12, we had another 46 pounds. Well, just pulling that sample a little bit deeper, and that's only a 12-inch sample, I've got enough fertility there to grow the crops on that farm that I don't need to apply additional potassium this year. And the same thing goes for sulfur. They only showed 24 pounds of sulfur in the top 4 inches, but with the cover crop roots and recycling this system and pulling these elements from deeper in the profile up into that root zone, our 4 to 8 had an additional 31 pounds and our 8 to 12 had 57 pounds. That eliminated our sulfur application as well for that farm. So, maybe as farmers, we need to start looking at pulling some deeper samples and taking a credit for what we're seeing in these zones. So we started using a new soil sample as well. There's the regenerative certified test that Region Ag Labs is now offering. We pulled our samples this fall. It's a typical Haney test, but they have new management now that we can actually test a deeper profile sample to see the inherent qualities of those soils. And then we can test that farmer zone of influence in that 0 to 6 and really get a good idea. Are we regenerating our soils? Are our soils working and competing and actually being a regenerative type soil in that main influence zone that I have as a farmer? And this is just essentially what they put on there. It was ran by Lance on 11/11, and we ran the regenerative certified test. And it was just a comparison of where we were at versus where we're at now. And it kind of gives us, a place that we want to hit to consider our grounds are actually, going in the right direction to be regenerative or not. And then, one of the key things that we pay attention to, I don't know if you don't use the Haney test and it is something that you want to try as a producer, one of the key things that we pay attention to are the biological indicators. The first one is the WEOC, or the water extractable carbon. That is essentially the food source that feeds the biology. And then the other part is our 24-hour burst test, looking at, that microbial activity, releasing that CO2. The higher the CO2 release, the more that we're seeing biological activity, and the more biology that we see in that activity is also a higher nutrient release for us. And so one of the things that, is really critical for the 2022 growing season is nitrogen management. Our nitrogen in North Carolina right now is $1.20 a pound between urea and UAN. And so, to utilize a test, this is from our samples that we've pulled this last fall, but to see that we've got 46 additional pounds of organic nitrogen on most of our farms, and to be able to have a test that recognizes that's going to save me at least $50 an acre in nitrogen input for this upcoming growing season, that we were able to get that information. And so we, like I said, doing a lot of tests with NC State. This is our plots from about 2 years ago. And the thing that really got me was all of these plots were no-till except number 2. And that's the one that's the square. And so where we had cover crops, where we had some livestock integration, where we had our soil health management really kind of pushing, we put no nitrogen on one of the plots. And when I say plots, these are about 5 acres each. They're not the 500-foot long by a planter width wide. We try to do some bigger plots to take into consideration field variation. Where we put no nitrogen on at all, the tillage plot actually did the worst. We only yielded roughly about 80 bushels. But where we applied 50 units of nitrogen, we saw a spike of yield, and that 80 bushel plot went up to about 120. We put another 50 units of nitrogen on, it went up to around 155 to 160. And then another 50 units of nitrogen got us up in that 175 bushel range. And that showed that yield did increase in that tillage plot with nitrogen application. But the thing that really got me is, look over here on the left. That's one of the things that Rick Haney pointed out to me when I was showing him my slide is, over here on the left, we had 3 plots with cover crops. We didn't get to apply nitrogen on them, and we were still yielding 130, 155, and 180 bushel corn. I'm not saying that corn doesn't require nitrogen. I believe with the university, data from, several ones across the country, it takes about a pound to a pound and a quarter of nitrogen to grow a bushel of corn. But does that mean that I have to apply that as a farmer, or can I have a healthy system where I'm building nitrogen with cover crops? I'm taking a credit from our cover crop residue, where we do nutrient testing on our cover crop residue. Even organic matter breakdown, you've got 4% organic matter soils, you're typically going to see 20 to 25 pounds of nitrogen from that during the growing season. Farmers really need to understand that we can take credits for this and still yield a profitable crop without massively high inputs. And so this is what our corn looked like. We do try to look for tip back. Your corn ear on the right had a full rate of nitrogen. The ear in the middle had a half rate of nitrogen, and the ear on the left had no nitrogen at all. And these are from our plots when we were out picking them. So to see that we've had a small amount of tip back shows that we maximized our inputs and still had a very good crop that was profitable. We went out here, started picking these crops. This is a picture of me with my extension agent. Got these crops harvested. The full rate of nitrogen crop yielded, I think it was like 198 bushels. We lost 5 bushels of corn with a half rate of nitrogen, and where we applied no nitrogen at all, we lost 9 bushels. Back before we had the increase on the board for the corn prices, we were at about $4 a bushel. Yield wise, we lost $20 an acre with a half rate of nitrogen. We lost $36 of yield an acre with no nitrogen at all. But our savings on the no nitrogen, we saved $105 an acre on our nitrogen cost. This coming season for 2022, that would be over $225 an acre in savings on nitrogen cost. So are you willing as a farmer to sacrifice $30, $35, $40 in yield to save $150, $200 an acre in input prices? I would give up 50 to save 150. That just makes smart sense for us. So looking at, our farm, we really do try to focus on farming for profit, not for yield. We do have some good yields most years, but we do try to focus on return on investment. So we didn't have to spray 520 acres of corn. We didn't have to post-spray 360 acres of beans. Our chemical savings was a little over $22,000 in our system. The biggest thing for us was our fertilizer reductions. We saved a little over $23,000 on phosphorus. Potassium, we saved $16,000, and nitrogen, we saved $38,000 based on taking those credits and utilizing the Haney test. And, like I said, again, coming up for this 2022 season, you could almost double those numbers. I'm kind of interested to see, how our numbers turn out for the end of this coming growing season and what that's going to correlate into, because I think it'll be a substantially higher number. So Gabe Brown loves cocktails. David Brandt always wants to tell you about his radishes, and I like to tell you about my corn. I always try to put something in there just to kind of make sure everybody's awake. This is how we check our corn. We go out, we do like every other farmer each year. We look at variety, we look at ear feel, we look at, what are we seeing in our crop as far as disease. I'm pretty sure Illinois was one of the states that had a lot of issues with tar spot. I don't think tar spot's going to go away anytime soon, but understand that as farmers, 80% of the diseases that we face as farmers are soil-borne pathogens. And simply keeping that ground covered to where when it rains, we don't get raindrops making that detachment effect of the soils. Because if you look at disease typically starts at the bottom of the plant and works its way up. There are a few exceptions. But to be able to combat 80% of the diseases I face as a farmer simply by keeping that ground covered with some kind of biomass really does help us in our plant health. So we went out and started picking our corn crop. We had some pretty good yields. This is Durr, one of our extension agents. And when we started picking the corn, we ended up our highest corn that year was 318.15 bushels, and that's dry land. We've had several fields now that we've been in the 315 to about 350 bushel dry land corn. Our bean yields are still going up, and we've broken the 100 bushel bean marks already. So for me to look at what we've done with our ground, for me it definitely proves that we're seeing a higher return with less inputs with these regenerative practices. And, one of the things that I really like to focus on with farmers, if you grow corn, pull stalk nitrate samples. Out of all the places I've been to, it just seems like it's one of the practices that farmers don't do a lot of. I look at it as a report card at the end of the season. Pulling stalk nitrate samples really helps us not only look at nitrogen, but also planting populations. Can I increase planting populations to try to push yield a little bit? Our nitrate, if we had a decent weather year and our nitrate levels are super low, maybe we push population too hard on that farm. So there are a lot of key components to pulling these stalk nitrate samples that allow us to adjust our practices for the next year. And then looking at new things that we're trying this new 60-inch corn. Like I said, we do have some livestock that we graze. And, the 60-inch corn allows us to go out and plant cover crops in between the middles of the rows. And essentially the day that we cut that corn crop, we're able to introduce livestock into there and have forage for them to graze instead of trying to establish a winter cover crop after the corn. And then it has to grow during some of the cooler days. And we're not seeing a yield hit. I've worked with, Lauren Steinloggy and I was a good friend that kind of really helped us understand the management, and Mitchell. But this 60-inch corn, I think we lost about 3 to 4 bushels per acre on the corn, but we had about 8,100 pounds of biomass, dry matter for our cattle to consume the day this was harvested, which what we're seeing in our cattle gains, plus not having to feed hay, greatly makes up for that 4 bushel difference. So, those are some of the things that we're trying out, the last couple of years. And then, like they said earlier, building our own markets, partnered with Foothills Distillery, started with moonshine, started making the first bourbon in North Carolina since Prohibition. And we've won several gold medals with that bourbon at the World Spirit Awards. We started up a new company. It's actually going to really, launch in February this month of this year, Farmers Reserve Distillery, where we're working with, any farmer in America that wants to work with us as a distillery. We're looking at putting one in potentially in Indiana, Iowa, Texas, and then still we're making it here in North Carolina. And we're making bourbons, whiskeys, and vodkas. And this is kind of a picture of our label on the right. That's our Farmers Reserve. When Rick Kaesebier retired from the ARS, I actually made a new bourbon for his retirement called the Bourbon of Legends. And it's a brown sugar infused bourbon. And then we're also working with breweries, whether it be barley, triticale, wheat, oats. There's so many small grains that these craft breweries want to work with. And we started working with malt houses, Sierra Nevada, New Belgium, and really trying to look at, different products that we can see a higher return. And farmers are doing this all over the country. And it really just takes some phone calls and a little bit of networking. And it does take time and management. But for what we're seeing on the return, it's definitely worth it. And so this is my biggest image. Essentially, as farmers, the one thing I've learned in 10 years of farming now is we can't control the markets. We can't control our input prices. But at the same time, if we get together collectively as a group, really we can take charge of a lot of that and have that group as far as buying power, selling power. It really does help us with our marketing. The Regen Mills that we started up is a group right now of 14 farmers in 12 states. And instead of me building my own website and another farmer having to build his website and his e-commerce, we decided, we wanted to do this as a group and a community. And so it really has given us the power to market a very large area of the country. And the one thing I will say is this success is not mine. This is a picture of what I call my group, my people. I have met so many amazing people on this journey, people that were willing to share their knowledge and their information, their ups and their downs, is really one of the reasons that we have had the success that we have in the last 10 years is being able to learn from others and try new things. And that's one of the reasons why we try to share with farmers. Anyone who's interested in trying these practices, we're always available and try to share their information so that they can have success as well. Do we have any questions, Todd?
Oh, you bet. We have questions.
Okay.
First, someone asked about a little history of the farm that you're on. Was it conventional tillage to begin with?
Most of our farms were conventional tillage. This is, used to be pretty big tobacco country around here. Cotton was here typically until about the early 2000s, which was pretty heavy conventional tillage. So yeah, most of the farms we picked up are fairly degraded, low organic matter, low fertility, high weed issues. That's typically what we pick up.
You mentioned a 7-way cover crop mix. Can you tell me what species are in that mix? Yeah,
so our main mix that we try to push, we just call it the home run mix because we're kind of shooting for the fences, but it's cereal rye, triticale, oats, crimson clover, winter peas, vetch, and rape. And there's a complexity and a reason that we have those species in there. The small grains have 3 different carbon to nitrogen ratios. So the legumes in that mix are typically going to break down in the first 30 to 45 days of the season. And that's good for a young growing crop to have those nutrients released. But we want to have nutrients at the end of the season for grain fill. And so the oats will break down, then the triticale, and then eventually the rye. And it gives us a chance to spoon feed that crop later in the season by having those different species.
Can you elaborate a bit more on the soil health calculation, which parameters are used, and what does the formula look like?
As far as the Haney test, is that what you're asking?
About the soil health calculation itself.
Okay, so the region certified testing, I honestly don't. I don't have the formula. Like that was developed by Rick Haney and Lance Gunderson at Region Ag Labs. But my understanding of it is they are testing our inherent soil qualities in that 6 to 12, and then they're testing that against what we have influenced in the 0 to 6. And they have a formulation in a way that they've put that together, and that's called the region certified test. And so if they wanted information on that test, the easiest way would to get a hold of Lance.
So you did talk about the Regen Lab and about the Haney test that they did, but when you were going through most of the numbers from a different lab, I believe, what lab was that? And I think it was the Mitchell test. Is that correct? And why did you focus on it?
So it was the other test that you would have seen would have been from Waters Laboratories. And we use Waters Lab or NC State Lab because both of them do the Millic 3. So like really sandy soils in that Delta area, they typically run like a Millic 1. Here in North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, most farmers use Millic 3, and that's the extraction method that they use to test the soil versus, Midwest is probably, Olson or Bray, P1, P2. And it just has to do with how they're doing their extractions. And so, we look at Millic 3, which is what is the standard or was the standard in our area versus our Haney test. And it really gives us a way to look at this one called for X number of pounds of, say, phosphorus and potassium, but the Haney test said this. And when we apply what the Haney test did and we apply what the Millic did, we then look at that return on investment. Did the extra fertility make me more money, or did cutting back on fertility make me more money? So it gives our farm a way to look at, it validates what we're doing and which is making us the most money.
A cover crop rye, before soybean seems to be the one that most people will want to use. This person says they've heard and experienced both poor results of cover crop rye before corn. What are your thoughts?
So before soybeans, soybeans can only nodulate enough nitrogen for roughly about 300 pounds of nitrogen is what soybean can nodulate a plant. If it takes 6 units of nitrogen to make a bushel of beans, that means that that bean is only going to nodulate enough for 50 bushels. We plant, we've heard the green bridge issues. We've heard about nematode issues, so many different issues. But every year we plant mixed species cover crops before soybeans with legumes in them, with no problems at all. There's people even in the I states that we consult with that do the same thing without those issues. And I'm not saying that they'll never have them or they won't have a bad year with it, but consistently they haven't yet. Before corn, yes, you can absolutely have issues with planting straight cereal rye before corn because of several issues. A lot of times farmers talk about, well, I planted rye and my corn was stunted when it came up, and that must be that allelopathic effect. That allelopathic effect, when you terminate rye, is a flash. It's gone very quickly. Typically, if we see an issue with like yellowing plants, they probably planted the corn in 45-degree soils instead of 55, and it's just cold. Carbon to nitrogen ratios are another huge component. So cereal rye that's 5 feet tall, probably 80-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, you've probably locked up all available nitrogen that was in that soil profile. And that's why I said in the beginning that using legume cover crops to balance out that carbon to nitrogen ratio, and also time of termination, depending on the height of the rye or triticale or even oats, we really try to shoot for that 40-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio so that we're not locking nutrients up from that corn crop.
Have you tried terminating after the crop is in, and how did that work?
So when we first started farming, we didn't have a sprayer. The co-op would come, spray 100 acres. We would plant and roll it down. We plant everything green now. We plant green, and then we follow, within a day or two, maybe 3 days with a sprayer if we have to spray. So we haven't seen issues with that as well.
But you're crimping as you go, right?
Yeah, we crimp as we go.
All right. Insect control related to the cover crop as well as weed control. Do you think you're doing better or worse?
I would say absolutely better on both. Like I said, my neighbors were spraying insecticide 2 or 3 passes this year. We didn't spray a single insecticide. Weed control, the university sent out some extension students, interns. And the funny thing to me was, it's not that we don't have the weeds. Like, we will find pigweeds that are 2 feet long that are growing with the rye that's been laid down, but they don't have enough energy to break up through it, and they'll start turning this white color and they die before they can get out and get the sunlight. So I mean, we still have weed seeds and we still have weeds, but that residue mat just absolutely smothers them to where we're not having to compete with them as much.
Hey, back to your soil test. Were those in pounds or in parts per million? And this person says they question using a sum total of available nutrients by zone and worried that the soil is being mined.
Haney test is in pounds. The Waters laboratory test would have been in parts in ppm. As far as being mined, yes, I'll say that we are mining it in a different context than probably what most people mean when they say that. So if you do a total nutrient test, essentially we can test for what's there, and we have a lot of nutrients there. They just are not available. And we either have to unlock them utilizing biological processes, or we have to add fertilizer to the ground as an input. And whoever it was, if they would like to see our data, like I said, we'll share data with anybody. We have a farm that we have made 150 plus bushel corn crops and 50, 60 bushel bean crops on that we have not applied P or K to for 7 years. And our numbers continue to go up. And it's simply because we're using a system to unlock what's already there in our inherent soils. So yes, are we mining some of the nutrients? We are, but not in the sense that we're drawing down nutrient levels.
Can you say a bit more about sugar as treatment for insects? And then we're going to wrap up with you.
Using sugar for insects is more of it's a deterrent. So it's not killing the insect. It doesn't kill the bug. We want to get the Brix level above 14. So you take a refractometer, you take a plant leaf, you squeeze the juice out of the plant leaf onto the refractometer, and that tells you the sugar content level in that plant. And when we maintain above 14, what will happen is a stink bug will fly onto a soybean plant, and say if it eats a small amount of that leaf, that sugar content is retained in that bug, and it essentially pesters the bug to the point that they don't want that plant anymore. They look at the spectrum in which they see plants is different than how we do, and plus the sugar content is not, they cannot process it. So the higher the sugar content, the less that predator insect is likely to eat that plant. So that's why we shoot for 14 or above. We really like to maintain 20 or above on our farm, but it helps with a lot of our insect issues.
Hey, Russell, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time with us today, and really good stuff. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Hey, some would like to contact you. Can you put some contact information into the chat box for us, please?
Yep, I'll put my email in there now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. The Russell Hedrick is from North Carolina. He's with JRH Grain Farms. Well, let's take some time now and think about a different subject, one that you've been hearing about a lot. In fact, all week on my radio programs, we've been hearing about this, carbon markets, and it is a big issue across the globe and in the nation. Washington, D.C. certainly is considering carbon markets at this point. Dr. Emily Bruner is here. She's the Midwest Science Director at the American Farmland Trust, and she's been a proponent of conservation agriculture for over a decade. She's going to help us out on this subject matter. And Dr. Bruner is the Midwest Science Director for AFT, the American Farmland Trust, where she works, or her work focuses on identifying ways to accelerate adoption of soil health practices while simultaneously increasing the resiliency and productivity of Midwest farms. Prior to her current role, she served as the director for the Vigo County Soil and Water Conservation District, as a hydrologist with the United States Forest Service, and an adjunct faculty member at St. Mary the Woods College, and as an extension associate for natural resources. Now, her work on nitrogen cycling in agricultural systems also led her to DC to investigate climate change mitigation policy as a research fellow with the Congressional Research Service. Dr. Bruner, thank you so much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Todd. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
And are my slides up?
They are.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Todd, for the introduction. Emily Bruner, the Midwest Science Director for American Farmland Trust, which is a national nonprofit organization focused on preserving farmland, promoting sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. I'm based here in my home office in East Central Illinois. Already had a wonderful introduction, so I'll spare you that. And I'm just excited to be with you all this morning to talk about important considerations and opportunities around carbon markets. So in late 2020, my colleague June Brokish and I brought together over 30 organizations from Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and Wisconsin, with the main goal of helping farmers and conservation professionals navigate the growing availability of market incentives for ecosystem services. We hosted several ecosystem market webinars, in 2021, detailing offerings from over 10 different providers. And we've summarized the key elements of each of those offerings in a program comparison table, which is available along with the recorded webinars on ISAP's website. So hopefully we can put that in the chat. And then also I'll have a link on a couple of the slides later on in the presentation. So over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to try to give us a brief background on agricultural sources of greenhouse gas emissions, a little bit of background around carbon credits and ecosystem markets, and then summarize some of the on-farm opportunities around the greenhouse gas reduction potential of practices, some market approaches, and then some of the financial assistance and return on investment opportunities as well. So briefly, we know that greenhouse gases are produced in multiple sectors via transportation, industry, et cetera. But this slide kind of provides some of the context for sources of greenhouse gases emitted along the agricultural supply chain. One of the reasons for all the excitement, if you will, around carbon smart ag practices is that these practices are immediately available to mitigate greenhouse gases and improve the resiliency of agricultural production. So, changes in on-farm management, as we've already heard from our wonderful speaker this morning. Changes in management, like reducing the number of field operations, precision nutrient management, and planting cover crops, among several others, can offer carbon sequestration benefits and reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, while we invest in technological solutions to address some of the other sectors of the supply chain, the pre-production or the post-production processes. So before I get too much further, I just want to go ahead and pause to define what carbon dioxide equivalents are. The values in this presentation, as well as a lot of times we hear about carbon credits in general, are expressed as carbon dioxide equivalents and reported in metric ton increments. Carbon dioxide equivalents are essentially a measure used to compare the emissions from various greenhouse gases based on their global warming potential. So the three main greenhouse gases reported for agricultural practices include carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. And essentially, emission of 1 million metric ton of methane and nitrous oxide respectively would be equivalent to emissions of 25 and 298 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. So briefly again, what ecosystem markets and all the excitement, we like to kind of look at these as just another tool in the toolbox to help us scale some of these soil health systems. In general, these are payments to protect, restore, or mitigate for impacts to ecosystems. A lot of the practices that we talk about within the ecosystem market context are often already a part of traditional state and federal incentive programs. However, in the market context, the payments are generated via outcomes and they need to be verified at the field level. So they're not necessarily practice specific. And markets exist for carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas reductions, water quality, and others, including biodiversity, et cetera. So, what's driving this demand? What's driving all of this talk and excitement? So, when we talk, especially within the context of the agricultural supply chain, consumer demand and corporate responsibility have motivated many national and international corporations to set voluntary greenhouse gas emission targets and develop science-based strategies to achieve desirable environmental outcomes. So on this slide, the left kind of shows a very generalized ag supply chain, and then the right shows a very generalized representation of some of the key players in that space. And so if we focus in primarily here, at that kind of manufacturing level, and some of our consumer packaged good manufacturers like our PepsiCos or our General Mills, et cetera, this is where we've seen a lot of growth in the demand for carbon credits in the ag space. So from 2019 to 2020, corporations represented about 96% of the rise in voluntary market transactions. And those corporations essentially were led by, our consumer goods companies, a couple of financial institutions, and then energy industries. And so, as the product moves through the supply chain, there are multiple points where greenhouse gases may be produced, and then, of course, opportunities to reduce. But if we look at, kind of again, aligning along that manufacturing and consumer packaged good companies, especially where that increased demand is, over 80% of the carbon footprint from these different corporations is upstream. So, you know, if a corporation has a target to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, a lot of times, you know, it's easier, kind of back to my first point around that, you know, on-farm management. A lot of corporations are focusing on some of those shovel-ready practices. And so those would be there at the top of the supply chain around that on-farm production, and seeing if we can implement some of the practices that we know can contribute some of these benefits. So really quickly, you know, just a brief, very oversimplified schematic of kind of the carbon credit process. And if we look at, you know, some of the key stakeholders here being, you know, buyers, carbon standard organizations and registries, and then project developers. And then just, you know, a brief summary of exactly what these credits are. So essentially, you know, a carbon credit or a carbon offset is an activity that's designed to compensate for the emission of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. So it may be regulatory or voluntary. And within carbon and greenhouse gas markets, offsets specifically refer to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent reduced, avoided, or sequestered by an entity to compensate for emitting that ton elsewhere. There's also insetting as well within a specific corporation's supply chain. So carbon markets also exist under mandatory compliance schemes and voluntary programs. So compliance markets are created and regulated by mandatory national, regional, or international carbon reduction regimes. And then voluntary markets function outside of compliance markets and enable companies and individuals to purchase carbon offsets on a voluntary basis with no real intended use for a compliance purpose. So there's multiple entities and players in the space, and a lot of times it really kind of revolves around what the demand is and then what the supply is, as far as, you know, what type of credit is a particular buyer interested in, and how is the project developer or, you know, the supplier of that credit helping to guarantee what kind of quality they want to see in that particular credit. And so just quickly, you know, here is kind of a summary of how many credits Illinois farmers can generate. These are just the annual GHG greenhouse gas emission reduction potentials of converting to no-till and planting cover crops as estimated per individual practices at the state level via Comet Planner. So all values are reported in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per acre per year. And then the averages, you know, the state averages here are in parentheses. And then I'd also like, you know, I spend a lot of time kind of trying to help us understand, you know, what the reduction potential around no-till and cover crops are. But of course, there's multiple other practices that can help to store carbon via, you know, cropland conversion, woody cover, restoration of disturbed lands, and some of the edge of field practices on some of the marginal lands that could also really contribute to accrediting or an increase in carbon sequestration. So, you know, in general, we have this broad consensus around, you know, the large opportunity for soil health practices to sequester carbon and to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. But there remains a lot of work to be done, particularly in the voluntary market space, to kind of verify those credits and to mitigate the risk, both on the supply and the demand side. So a lot of the kind of keywords and terminologies that you'll hear around this space are listed here. So in kind of very oversimplified terms, you know, additionality is the requirement essentially that an activity and the resultant greenhouse gas reduction or removal are additional to what would have happened in the absence of a payment. So here's where you're looking at, you know, that kind of requirement for new practices. Some approaches looking at, you know, specific look back windows of practices. There are multiple different strategies here to kind of get around that component and deal with that additionality factor. Then of course we have permanence. You know, a lot of this is based around how long that carbon is actually going to be sequestered or removed. And so depending on different protocols, practices may need to be maintained for 10, 20, or even up to 100 years. So a lot of times thinking about different contracting links terms and some of these offerings is how they're getting around some of those issues. There's also, you know, buffer pools, which are established to kind of mitigate the risk due to unplanned losses. So, you know, if the farmer is paid based on a carbon capture through no-till, and 1 year you may need to till, there's buffer pools and structured payments involved to help cover some of that risk on on the developer side. So then there's also what we call leakage, which refers to the accounting for the full effect. So, did you need additional fuel to plant your cover crop? And making sure all the kind of inputs and outputs are being included in that accounting. That's again another oversimplification, but just an example to help contextualize what that means. And then also, of course, is verification. So, was the practice implementation successful? Not only did the practice get put in place, but, the verification of whatever outcome was estimated or, even modeled to have occurred. So, to put some of this back into context, just thinking about, okay, well, why do I necessarily, as a farmer or conservation professional, need to be aware of some of these key concerns and approaches? As everybody likes to say, this kind of is the wild, wild west. And there's a reason. There's protocol setters, there's standard setters, there's registries. And right now in the voluntary market space, a lot of folks are still trying to really figure out how to design approaches that really work and achieve the desired climate targets. And so, just to kind of, again, put this into context, a report that just came out last week from Bloomberg NEF modeled, how some of these different markets and structured payments, and essentially, how this increasingly complex set of initiatives and frameworks and regulations will or could set prices in the long term. And, kind of the takeaway there is, our forecasted carbon offset price could reach as high as $120 a ton or as low as $47 a ton by 2050, depending on how some of all these things play out. So there's going to continue to be the market. The market's not going to go anywhere, and it's going to continue to expand. But based on how these credits are qualified and based on kind of the quality, and then of course that's going to drive the demand, the supply and demand side, like any market in general. And there's multiple ways that this kind of price discovery could occur. So briefly, we did, as I mentioned, host several webinars to kind of summarize the state of play, if you will, back in 2021. And so some of the carbon programs that we featured were NORI, Indigo Ag, Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, and Ecosystem Market Consortium. One thing that separates, the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund and the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium is that they're also tied with other payments for other ecosystem services. So it's not just a carbon payment. They're also offering payment for water quality. The Ecosystem Market Consortium is also factoring in some biodiversity as well. And then we've got, some of the main programs from our input providers. We've got, Bayer's US carbon program, Corteva has their carbon initiative, and then Nutrien has several carbon programs that are primarily in pilot stage at this point. Bayer in particular took a little bit of a different approach as far as how they kind of figured out their risk and what they wanted to qualify. And so Bayer in general is a per practice payment as opposed to like a specific carbon credit payment. So they're paying currently about $3 an acre per year for no-till and strip-till, $6 per acre per year for cover crop adoption. And if you're implementing both, it would be a $9 an acre a year payment. And then some of the platforms is kind of how we bucketed the programs from SIBO, Farmers Business Network, and Truterra. Again, this information is current as of November of 2021, but all of these price points and all of these different offerings are continuing to evolve on a daily basis. So how the 2022 offerings are going to differ is yet to be seen. I know, for instance, SIBO, in their pilot phase, they're around $20 a credit, but they have some new pilots that they're rolling out in multiple different credit offerings that could be even a little bit higher, depending on eligibility. And so to tie that kind of back in, with our typical conservation incentive programs, just understanding, right, that there are additional ways to get some payments for implementing these practices and transitioning and moving into them. So of course, we have EQIP and CSP from USDA and Nrcs. And then of course, here in Illinois, we have our fall covers for spring savings, crop insurance discount program for cover crops. And then of course, our longstanding state cost share through IDOA and the Partners for Conservation program. So to kind of pencil that out and what that all means, as far as, bottom line payments that could be available to farmers in these different spaces. Again, if we take those emission reduction coefficient averages for the state of Illinois and put them here for, cover crop being a non-legume cover crop and then no-till, what would that market payment look like if we were just going at a basic $15 an acre payment rate? And so we've kind of penciled that out here for cover crops and no-till, and then kind of compared that to, the typical EQIP or CSP payments for those practices. Again, just kind of a general Illinois average off of, a basic cover crop, and then the no-till strip till practice standard for NRCS. And then, of course, these are all going to change depending, especially, the market payment and what you could expect to sequester are going to change across the state with different reduction potentials in different areas. But of course, as we know, right, it's not just about carbon, as we've already heard. Here's just a summary. The estimated cost of U.S. weather and climate disasters in 2020 was over $94 billion. We know we've got a surge in fertilizer and input costs. Just the other week or a couple of days ago, we had, Progressive Farmer summarize that, anhydrous has hit its all-time price high. So we know that all these things are continuing to plague farm management decisions and opportunities. And I don't necessarily need to go too far into this. I think our previous speaker did a really good job of summarizing the co-benefits and some of the return on investments that can also really benefit a farmer from implementing some of these soil health practices, right? So not just worried about a potential carbon payment, but also what is that return on investment for going ahead and making those changes, which we know, could sometimes require some significant upfront costs and risk on the farmer's behalf as they're transitioning. So AFT did do some case studies around soil health successful farmers, and here's just kind of a summary of some of those farms that we've done across the state in corn and soybean production to date. And so again, we're looking at that, average return on investment for these practices, and these did not include any kind of government or cost share payments. But when we're looking at, farmers who have implemented these practices over a, 4 to 6 year period, that average return on investment was around 132%. And then there's, dollar per acre savings for, machinery, fuel, and labor, average pesticide, reductions, and then fertilizer savings. And so some of those, how those case studies were generated can be found in the link here on the slide. And then, of course, you don't just have to take, the previous speaker or my word or AFT's word for it. There's plenty of research out there that's coming out that really summarizes the ways, that we're increasing resiliency by building our soil organic matter, and that, we're really contributing to that return on investment and the overall resiliency of the farm. So, in summary, adopting soil health practices and systems can increase crop resiliency and return on investment, but it's going to require additional investment to help see, a scaled approach to that. And ecosystem markets may be, as we mentioned, they're one tool in the toolbox, and they may be able to help incentivize adoption beyond the acreages that are already supported via state and federal programs. But again, as we know, not all programs and practices will fit every farm. So, farmers need to kind of set those realistic goals, talk to the folks who've already had success. And then if your plan does align with a particular program, then that might be an avenue to explore. So with that, I'll see if there's any questions.
We do have some questions for you, and those who have questions can also post them right into the chat box, and we'll get to those. Thank you, Emily, for your presentation. You'll have to forgive me. I've got a couple of questions for you, but I was in the middle of recording some weather for my radio broadcast this afternoon and don't know whether you addressed this or not. During the programs this week, I've been talking a lot about carbon markets. One of the issues that I'm having some difficulty grasping myself is how the payments are made. And I'm not sure that the companies have a good idea whether it's per acre, which I think some of them are paying on, what kind of, I don't know, what kind of technical issues are involved in, recording how much carbon is stored, and is that in pounds, and can you pay on that? What kind of payments do we think will develop? And is the federal government working on some kind of process so that this can be traded?
Whew, that's a big question, Todd. Multi-parts. I think, in general, I kind of did touch a little bit. And again, I will refer folks who are interested to the program comparison table that we have. That at least gives a little bit of an idea of when farmers can be expected to be paid. There's certain programs that have vesting schedules where they're going to already model what 5-10 year increase you're going to see in either carbon sequestration or reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and then they're going to structure their payment over those 10 years once they come back and do some soil sampling after the 3rd or 5th year to kind of align what was estimated and then what they're actually seeing on the ground. A lot of times, especially if it's a specific carbon credit program, it is going to be a payment based on that carbon dioxide equivalent, that CO2e number, which is that metric ton increment. But then there are, the programs, as I highlighted during the presentation, Bayer has taken an approach where they're literally just paying per practice. And so that would be, acres implemented of a specific practice at a flat rate. So there's multiple different ways that these organizations are trying to set programs and avoid risk for themselves, but then also be able to try to make an equitable playing field in their offering for farmers, which some are doing a better job of than others. But they're all struggling right now with making sure that they're kind of following along with the industry standard and the expectation, but then also acknowledging that a lot of these programs and a lot of the credits aren't necessarily going through registries. And so again, that wild west term is fairly applicable still, as even USDA and the federal government are trying to figure out what role they may play in trying to help not necessarily regulate, but at least kind of set some bounding boxes around what counts and what doesn't for different corporations to hit their net zero targets. One of the things, I guess, to kind of summarize that is at this point, it's really important for all the different developers to, at bare minimum, be transparent about the way they're structuring these programs. So that way the buyers can know what kind of quality credit they're being offered. So that way we don't avoid a bunch of low quality credits kind of saturating the market and then, taking a dive in the actual price discovery of those credits.
So we're going to move quickly, but I do have a couple of other questions for you. The current $25 per acre per grower and $5 per acre program that they're talking about in this new bill per year, or is that per year or a one-time payment?
I believe that's per year, and I don't know how far out they're planning on making those payments as far as what's being proposed right now by the federal program, because they're still kind of back and forth on exactly what's going to stay in there and what's going to be approved. But it is per year, and I'm not sure if that's a 3 to 5 year period or not.
And this one is always asked by those who are already doing practices. They want to know, will payments generated on outcomes benefit first-time adopters more than producers who are already long-term into no-till or cover crops?
Yeah, and that kind of gets down to that, additionality sticking point of one of the, key concerns as a lot of these programs are, developing. And it's really going to depend. A lot of them are paying for new practices. They're structuring their programs around, specific look back windows to try to help, encourage farmers who have already implemented some practices kind of recently to help, be a catch-all to be able to offer that to larger groups. But there's also, like I said, there's practices. True Terra's program, for instance, their 2021 offering was only for practices that had already been implemented. They did not go down the route of trying to quantify the benefits of new practices. So it's completely dependent on the program and the developer and how they want to try to tackle that additionality component of, would this have happened? Would this greenhouse gas reduction have happened if the payment hadn't been made? So, and again, that's also going to depend on whether or not the program developer is working in a strictly offset market or if it's more of an insetting within their own supply chain. There's a little bit more flexibility there.
Hey, thank you, Emily. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Emily Bruner joined us. Thank you, from AFT, the American Farmland Trust. Let's move on now. We're going to talk a little bit about some opportunities on the horizon in agroforestry on a commercial scale with Katie Adams. She is with the Savanna Institute. Katie leads that institute on agroforestry demonstration farm programs and helps to build community through agroforestry education across Illinois and beyond. Her background is in anthropology from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, helping to illuminate deep ecological and social connections created through agriculture, and informs her work in building bridges between landowners, farmers, industry builders, and researchers. Katie's drawn to agroforestry for its powerful reimagining of a future that is abundant, perennial, and quite beautiful. Katie will join us in just a moment, and she's in addition, she likes to plant trees and to talk about pawpaws. She teaches community classes as well, some seasonal cooking, fermentation, talks about canning, and she runs the Red Crib Acres, a small apple orchard on rented land with her husband, John Williams. Good morning to you, Katie. We're glad to have you with us, and we can see your presentation at the moment. It's coming up. There we go. Thank you, Katie, for being with us today. We're all ready for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Todd, and thank you so much for inviting me to present today. My name is Katie Adams. I'm based in Champaign-Urbana in East Central Illinois, but work broadly throughout the state. And I'm excited to share a little bit more information about agroforestry, which was simply the inclusion of trees in agriculture in our work at the Savanna Institute. So we often view farm landscapes with agriculture on one side of the farm, conservation often as an edge of field practice on the edges, and the natural world is somewhere kind of off in the distance. But the root of the matter is that this viewpoint can sometimes lead to some issues that we're seeing here in Illinois and across the United States and around the world. So sometimes when we have non-conservation annual production, we're seeing nitrogen and phosphorus water pollution, increases in soil erosion, and input heavy agricultural practices. But when we incorporate conservation and parts of the natural world, such as practices that we see in forests through perennial production in those deep root systems, then we see roots capturing nutrients, stabilizing soil, and then leading to more balanced inputs, which can sometimes minimize those costs, especially in a year like this year, as well as the need to cut down on some of the inputs that we often see come off the farm. So agroforestry is just one tool in a large toolbox of conservation that can be a transformative option for agriculture here in Illinois and the Midwest. When we think about agroforestry or the incorporation of trees into agriculture, we're really looking at some transitions. So we're looking at transitioning land or parts of land from annual production into perennial production. So continuous living cover, roots and soils. Agroforestry also encourages some herbaceous transformation. So from herbaceous crops into woody crops. So things like timber, tree crops such as fruit and nuts, or even florals like willows or things like that. We're really moving from a monoculture system into a polyculture system. So the more species that we can get on the landscape, mixes of herbaceous and woody, annual and perennial, the more resilient we're going to be over time. And we're also moving from open systems where we have a lot of inputs coming from the outside to the more closed systems that we see in forest systems. So I love Ray Archuleta for a lot of reasons, but he often will go out to the sides of farms, especially if there's wooded areas, and pull up some soil from those wooded areas to compare it to what's happening in agricultural fields. That forest is a closed system. It's producing what it needs for abundance and for good soil health and nutrients. So what exactly is this thing called agroforestry? As I mentioned earlier, simply it's the introduction of trees into agricultural systems. And the USDA kind of views this within a suite of practices that they support both in research and education, as well as funding through NRCS and other structures. So the 5 ones that are recognized by the USDA are forest farming, so the growth of agricultural products within wooded systems; silvopasture, which is the intentional and intensive introduction of livestock into trees. So this is enhanced pasture in wooded areas or the incorporation of trees into already established pastures. So much different than turning cows or pigs into wooded areas. And then the 3 ones that I'm going to focus on today, which have great opportunity here in Illinois and the Midwest, which is alley cropping, which is an infield practice, and then riparian forest buffers and windbreaks, which are edge of field practices. So we like to view agroforestry as a Swiss Army knife. And this is one of the reasons that I was drawn to agroforestry coming out of annual agricultural production, was because we can do a lot of things at once when we introduce trees onto farms. So depending on the goals of your farm landscape and your farm business, trees can play into a lot of different niches on that landscape. But the 2 ones I'm going to focus on today specifically are water quality and carbon sequestration. Those are big things that we're talking about a lot here in Illinois with conservation. And it's things that have a lot of funding and technical support around as well. So we know that perennial buffers and perennial crops have some of the highest nitrate reduction per acre of our conservation practices. So we can see up to 90% N reduction when we incorporate perennial buffers and perennial crops into those systems, thanks to those deep roots that tend to root down and keep nutrients in place before running off into waterways, as well as carbon sequestration and drawdown. So trees, and specifically trees in agroforestry that pair trees with other cropping systems, can have one of the biggest impacts. So actually the biggest impact we can have through agroforestry and tree planting is actually through silvopasture. So the introduction of trees and livestock together. But windbreaks, riparian buffers, and alley cropping also have huge carbon sequestration potential, even with modest adoption. So if we think about modest adoption, that's not every single farm landscape, but that's moving towards a majority of farm landscapes that can adopt these practices. So the first one that we're going to cover today are windbreaks. And these used to be a lot more common across the Midwestern landscape, but these are different than kind of the fence rows and hedgerows that we've seen and have been ripped out over time because they've become a nuisance. They've impacted crop yields. They're hard to farm around. But windbreaks are intentionally planted things that have a lot of advantages. So the big one that we talk about is windbreaks can enhance crop production and crop pollination. So what they do by doing that is by planting trees to block wind or other things that you want to keep off your farmland, providing really advantageous microclimates that can lead to earlier and larger crop maturity, can help control soil erosion, and especially for folks that are engaged in organic agriculture, they can help protect sensitive crops from drift. So you can design windbreaks to serve a lot of different functions on one landscape. They manage snow distribution, which can be particularly important in these days like we're having yesterday and today, where we're having drifting show up. And that in turn can protect livestock. And speaking of livestock, windbreaks are often used to reduce odors or unappealing sites between different farm operations. So like I said before, agroforestry is a Swiss Army knife, so it can do a lot of different things all at once. But the big ones that we kind of like to highlight are that protection and safety by modifying microclimates to protect and boost crops, increase productive soils and soil health. And then the third is the economic opportunities that come off of that. So we've heard a lot about return of investment, which is incredibly important. So you have to be able to make the investment and see that return over time. So that can be the infield crops. So for Illinois, that's often row crops that we're trying to boost the productivity of. But you can also put marketable crops in those windbreaks as well. So it doesn't always have to be just 2 rows of evergreens. There's lots of different opportunities to actually put a second crop into that conservation practice as well. So thanks to research that's been compiled by the USDA National Agroforestry Center, we know that when windbreaks are installed, we actually see increase in yields. So some crops more than others. So the highest yield boost is with winter wheat, but we also see a 12 to 13% boost for corn and soybeans respectively. And I know that competition is a huge question that I get asked a lot. Well, how do these trees, it doesn't make sense, right? We are planting these trees and they have to be impacting the annual crop production. But there's lots of different ways to mitigate that. Through root pruning, through very careful planting and species choices of what you're harvesting, as well as the particular design of how to do that, how to design that windbreak for maximizing yields and maximizing conservation potential. So I wish I had more time to go into design, but I'll get to it a little later, but we have lots of technical assistance that can help with that. So one example that I'm throwing up here is one from here in Illinois. This is Rock Creek Farm in Peatone, Illinois. And this is a 26-acre windbreak that was designed to be a demonstration to provide wind protection, drift protection for the organic production that was happening on the landscape, as well as noise protection from an interstate that is less than a mile from this farm. It is CRP enrolled, so there was cost share for both the installation and a rental rate associated with this practice. And with climate smart practice incentives that are available through CRP right now, we're seeing historically high cost share rates as well as rental rates. And then here's another picture from a mature windbreak that I've worked in that has both trees for wind protection, but also trees for profit. So here's elderberry, which is one of those, and there's lots of different crops such as hazelnuts and persimmons and juneberries that were also incorporated into this windbreak. So the second practice I'm going to mention are riparian buffers. And this is the planting of trees along waterways. And the major reason we do this is for water quality. So we're reducing excess amounts of organics and nutrients that go into the water. And riparian buffers are a key strategy as part of the nutrient loss reduction strategy that we've been talking a lot about in Illinois. But it can also increase habitat as well as provide harvestable crops and prevent a little bit of floodplain issues that we sometimes see on agricultural lands, plus the added benefit of carbon storage. So I pull up this slide, not because you'll have time to read it, but to show that there's a million effects that riparian forest buffers can have, not only on the landscape in which they're planted, but also the adjacent cropland and agricultural lands. So hopefully you can get a recording or a PDF of this and go through all of these. But there's a lot of feedback loops that happen when we plant trees on landscapes, and it's especially important for riparian buffers. So with design, we think in terms of 3 zones. So we kind of have a wild unmanaged zone, which is closest to the stream for habitat. And then our 2 other kind of zones are kind of managed for production or specifically for wildlife, depending on your goals. And they go from larger trees into smaller shrubs, and then we go into cropland. So a lot of design considerations when putting one of these in. And one example is from a demonstration farm that I manage here in Illinois in Ogle County. And it's a multifunctional riparian buffer. So we designed this specifically for nutrient and erosion capture from a upland continuously grazed cow-calf operation to the north, as well as a 45-acre row crop operation that's upland to the south. So we have drainage that's coming in from both directions. So we strategically chose particular species to capture that nutrient and erosion. And then we also have a profitability element to this as well. So there's a saleable crop that will come off of this that doesn't affect the conservation benefit at all, and kind of ties into the whole farm business planning of this landscape. And then the third one I'm going to talk about is an in-field practice compared to windbreaks and riparian buffers, which are edge of field practices. And this is alley cropping. And alley cropping is something we're not so familiar with here in the United States, but it's been utilized in Europe and other parts of the world for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, because it's a really efficient way to grow multiple crops on one landscape. So when I talk about alley cropping, I'm talking about the alley, which is the row between the trees. I'm talking about the alley crop, which is in the middle, and then the tree rows, which are on the outside. So there's a ton of advantages. We're enhancing crop production and increasing crop pollination like windbreaks, reducing wind and water erosion. We're also creating advantageous microclimates. So we see less jumps in soil temp, we see higher water holding capacity, we see higher infiltration rates for water, which is really, what's really happening is we're improving soil health for that. And so like anything in field, there's potential challenges because it is intensive management and it does take land out of annual production, but it does put land into some longer term production systems as well. So when you're thinking about designing an alley cropping system, the big thing is that every agricultural system that's going to be in there, from what's happening in the alleys to what's happening in the tree rows, has to match together. So we have to think about size and type of equipment, root competition, landscape conditions, and light requirements. So I don't have time to go into design, but I want to invite you to visit the Memorial 4-H demonstration farm in Monticello, Illinois, where we have a larger scale commercial alley cropping system with timber crops and annual row crop production to really showcase what's possible for this in-field practice. I know I'm out of time, but I just want to highlight that the Savanna Institute does have a technical service program that helps folks access resources and funding, specifically through the Nrcs, to cost share and access rental rates for this type of agricultural conversion. And we're working with an RCPP project that has direct funding for all the practices that I just mentioned. So thank you so much for your time, and I wish I could talk more about trees.
Well, we've got some time. You're going to talk a bit more about trees, Kaitie. I think since you mentioned it at the end, can the riparian buffer practice cost share be applied to ditches used to drain farmland?
Yeah, so the specific riparian buffer practice is specifically for tree planting along riparian areas. So there are different Nrcs practices that can be cost shared through equipment and others that can really help address those drainage issues. But the riparian buffers that we work with are specifically with trees as part of that system.
Is there any government plan that could help this person reduce the overpopulated deer in central Illinois? They'd love to be able to develop a silvopasture, but the deer, he says, would destroy it, or she says, one of the two, and protecting every tree and shrub would be pretty cost prohibitive.
Yeah, so through NRCS cost share funding for silvopasture establishment, NRCS will cost share not only the cost of the tree, but also for tree tubes, which we use to protect from deer, as well as the labor to install the tree, as well as the tree tubes and the mats. So we've been experimenting with a lot of deer protection over the past couple of years on our demonstration farms, and that is part of cost share funding.
When you showed the
deer protection,
when you showed the farm early on that had the CRP acres on it, I wondered whether that the trees on the edge of that farm were designed also to be profit centers. It wasn't clear whether that was the case or not.
Yeah, so that is a 10-row windbreak that was there. So the first few rows of that windbreak were mostly for conservation and wind protection, but the internal trees were for profit. So part of that included some fruit and nut production specifically, so that if the landowner chooses not to re-enroll in CRP, those trees would be mature and producing at that time.
What do you use to protect trees from beavers?
This is a really great question, and it's not something that I have a ton of experience with, but I'm working with a couple of clients right now in Illinois that do have issues with beavers. So I've been digging into this a little bit more. And there's particular tree species that beavers do not like do not like to eat or take down if they have access to other trees. So potential kind of solutions are planting of different trees and woody crops as a trap crop, or, you know, enhancing their habitat in different areas. So basically, it's something that it's a person, or not a person, it's a thing that we have to work with. So we just have to find good solutions to balance those.
Who or what most influenced your views of incorporating trees, buffers, and perennials into cropping systems?
Yeah, this is a really great question. I don't actually have one person that I can really point to. A lot of folks come to this work through their personal experiences with trees. So as someone that grew up in Southern Illinois and spent a lot of time in the Shawnee National Forest, I saw their, you know, the trees' immense potential to enhance habitat and provide beauty and conservation across the landscape. So it's mostly from the natural world that I came to do this work, and not actually from one person in general, but most of hiking.
Indeed. And people would like to be able to contact you if you are willing. Can you share that in the chat as well?
Yep, I'll share my contact information, and we have a technical service program in partnership with Nrcs that can help connect you with resources and technical assistance. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Kaitie. Well, let's continue now our conversations here on the Conservation Cropping Seminar for 2022. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to talk about the pragmatic side of this conservation cropping agriculture with farmers across the state of Illinois that have been actively involved in the process. Cade Bushnell will join us from Ogle County, Illinois. Rick Kaesebier is in Logan County, Illinois. And Jerry Seidel is in Jefferson County, Illinois. I think I'll start, Cade, with you, and we'll work our way southward. I'd like you to introduce yourself, tell me a little bit about the farm and the kinds of things that you have been doing there and what your transition was like.
Well, I guess I can start off by saying I'm no expert. I've just made a ton of mistakes. So a lot of you guys out there that are interested in this information, I'm open for contact. Get a hold of me somehow. I'll talk you through things, maybe talk you down off a ledge, which I've done with several other cover crop farmers, and give you an opportunity. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. I can tell you what may or may not work on your farm, but I can tell you what will work on my farm. So I am a second generation farmer. My dad started farming in the late 50s. He didn't come from a farming background, so he had no preconceived notion. And so he was willing to try just about anything. So he installed a lot of structures on the farm, terraces, waterways in the early 60s. I am, at the risk of sounding tough, I'm 62 years old and I have never run a moldboard plow. I've chisel plowed my entire life. So we started chisel plowing in the early 60s, my dad did. And that kind of conservation ethic has just spilled over into me. He started no-tilling in the 70s. I joined the farming operation after graduating from Iowa State. I know it's Iowa, but I love Iowa State. Got a good education there. Came back to the farm in '82, and my dad retired about '91. And so I took a lot of the things he started and just kept working on it. So we farm. I am currently incorporating my son, who's 26 years old, into the farm, and this is a young man who's never run any tillage equipment. So we farm about 1,500 acres together. I farm about 1,100 acres alone. So on this slide, there's several things going on here. And I want to address one question that was asked earlier about allelopathy and rye. And rye is a very effective nutrient scavenger. And that is the one I have to rely on most, because we're so far north, we don't have time. So I will plant soybeans into tall rye, big rye, let the carbon nitrogen ratio get way out of whack, which may be 80 to 1 or 100 to 1, and that residue is very durable. And so soybeans go into big rye. I do not have a method to roll it down. It seems to not be an issue. It's not a harvest issue. Some farmers might think it is, but it's not. So as far as allelopathy planning, so soybeans are planted green in general on my farm, and corn is planted usually boot top high. You have to manage the carbon nitrogen ratio in the rye and not let it get too wide on the corn crop. So what you're doing is you just treat them a little differently for what crop you're planting behind the cover crop. Legumes, I've tried a lot of things on some acreage where I had small grains. I've tried every cover crop you can imagine. And the only one that seems to work in a corn soybean rotation is rye. And that's because if you don't get it planted early enough, which I struggle with, we plant all our rye with the 750 drill. Some of it doesn't come up in the fall, but it will make good growth in the spring. So in the upper right-hand corner, you're looking back at my planter, and there is actually 2 forms of liquid going on that, and that's the corn planter. Because you have to manage that nutrient desert that is created by the rye, cereal rye being planted. And it will pull, I will tell you, allelopathy is very rare in corn following rye. But what is really there a lot is the fact that it's scavenged all the nutrients, and that corn will suffer. So on that planter, there is 32 being applied on a 2x3 spacing. And then if you look in the bottom, you can see the tanks on the tractor. That is a good quality starter fertilizer that goes on, and it really alleviates that. You have to manage the nitrogen. You cannot do a one and done and over the top. You just have to manage that. So I've tried a lot of things, and we experiment every year. This is on the left here is my dad. And my dad, if I told him I was going to go back to tillage, there has been no tillage on this farm. We're not no-tillers, we're never tillers. And you have to remember that no-till is just not the elimination of tillage, it's an entire system. So that's my dad and my son, and I'm the guy who's digging in the dirt. And I will go every place with a spade in my pickup truck, because what we're really after is what the effect is on the dirt. The goal is what's going on the right-hand side of this slide, and that is the roots in the ground before a crop is planted. And that soil is high clay, heavily eroded clay, and has had several years of cover crops on it. And it totally has changed my operation, which has been a never-till operation, to incorporate cover crops, and it has eliminated almost all the compaction that I was suffering from, not necessarily suffering from, but I just didn't have a way to alleviate. So the fields, most of the fields look like the right-hand slide, where it looks like you're digging in a permanent sod pasture. And we all know as farmers what good soil looks like, and we know what soil looks like when we beat the soil health out of it. So there was a huge step up when we switched and started planting covers. And I've been planting cereal rye for probably 10 years intensively, and we get probably 800 to 1,000 acres of our farm covered with cover crops. I just can't quite do all of it. And cover crops they do a lot of things. One, they pull nutrition back to the surface of the soil. that tends to move through our soil profile and get farther and farther down in the profile. But the biggest single thing that it does is it keeps that biological activity and it in the soil and ramps it up. And it makes one thing we have learned that's very effective at is reducing our time to make the transition into no-till. Rather than taking 5 years to transition a intensively tilled field to no-till, it takes 2 or 3 if you incorporate 2 cover crops in that. And soils change dramatically, and it's hard to explain. I can't tell you how much difference it makes in the soil. Now, that also builds resiliency in here into the soil. And the one thing we've learned with cropping is this last summer, we had probably 4 to 5 inches of rain on some of our farms during the growing season. Very, very dry. We were missed by a lot of the rains, went close, but never hit us. And we were still able to produce 190 bushel corn. And if you had asked me at the end of the season before I harvested what my yield would have been, I would have told you my average would have been maybe 150. And cover crops build a huge amount of resiliency. They reduce weed competition. I haven't reduced input costs as much as I can. I think I can, because I haven't done a lot of testing. A lot of my information is anecdotal, but I can tell you what works and what doesn't work. And, you've got to decide that you're going to make the system work. And I do a lot of unintentional test plots, which would mean that I make a mistake and I observe those carefully. I have planted corn into tall rye. It is somewhat successful, but not my preference. So again, you're going to manage your cover crop, your cereal rye in particular is what I'm using. You manage it as 2 different crops. A head of corn, you kill it at boot top height, and I do that with Roundup and then some residual because we have pigweed species here we're worried about. And I will usually let that dry and get crispy dry, like in the right-hand side slide, you let it get very dry and dead. Or if your cover crops aren't getting big and you're planting early, I will plant them green and then kill it. But in general, I like to have them dead, but one of the biggest mistakes guys will do is the cover crop gets a little big on them and then they kill it and then it gets wet and it is a hindrance to planting once it's wet. You need to let it get crispy dry and you'll have a lot less interference. Anybody got any questions? So anyway, my dad loves the cover crops. He really does. And it's hard for him to imagine. If I told him I was going to go back to tillage, he would probably kick me off the farm. It's kind of an interesting transition for him because he used cover crops extensively in the 50s, but not the same way we use them now. So he was planting them and tilling them in. And I will say, in my opinion, the best use for cover crops is in a no-till system. I think you lose a lot of the advantages with tillage. I don't know if anybody has any questions or any ideas, but like I said, contact me if you want to talk, because there's a lot of things that I can't say here that we can show, on the farm.
Yeah. We can do that, and people can contact you. And well, of course, as they write questions, we'll get to them. But we do have a couple of other folks that are with us. Of course, Cade is in the northern part of the state in Ogle County, near Rochelle. In Logan County, in the middle of the state, near Lincoln and Springfield, is Rick Kaesebier. Thanks, Rick, for being with us. How are things on the farm there?
Well, they're wintry. It's white and it's nasty, and I've had enough of that. But anyhow, my wife and I, Callie, we farm in Logan County. It's just 20 miles or so north of Springfield, kind of right dead center in the state. Corn, soybeans, wheat. We had feeder cows, sheep, honeybees, chickens, and cover crops. And I was told a while back that chickens are kind of like the gateway drug to animals, and the wife's surprised with chickens, and now we just kind of went from there. But we started farming in the 1980 time frame. 16% interest rates, 250 acre nitrogen use was common or more. It was cheap, and 160 bushel yields. The grain marketing was easy. Markets had little movement. Caddy's dad used to say that he was always within 10 cents of the high on corn, which was not really nothing to brag about when it only had a 20-cent move every year. We started no-tilling soybeans in the mid-90s, corn about 10 years later. We've been cover cropping since 2015, planting green since 2017, and grazing the cover since 2018. First time we put cattle out on this ground, they weren't out there half an hour, and I received a text informing me that you can't put cattle on this good black Central Illinois ground. Of course, it was in jest because he's one of the other few guys in the area that actually run cattle out on the ground. Just kind of interesting, the views that are given. Between the cover crops, planting green, and the grazing, I'm sure the coffee shop had enough gossip to keep it busy for a few days. We're still no-till today, goal of having 15 different plants growing on each acre every 4 years. Now that's achieved by adding wheat into our rotation, a 10 to 12 way cover crop mix between warm and cool season cover crops. And that's always followed with some sort of grazing, either the sheep or the cattle out there grazing on that. And I like to refer to it as a vertically farming our acres. Instead of expanding on the horizon and picking up a lot more acres, we like to take what we have and just enhance what we have and add to it with different enterprises and different avenues. So instead of just the one crop, monocrop returning to us, we've got several different chances to make things work. I think one of the nicest things about the cover cropping and the grazing and integrating all this together is a return on investment for us. Has been nice. We've reduced input costs in some situations sizably. We do Haney testing and other sorts of tissue testing and stuff to let us know exactly what we need instead of what we think we need. And we've done nitrogen testing and to get a better idea of what the soil's actually going to return to us organically and not have to provide everything in a synthetic form. But we've been fortunate. We had Gabe Brown out on our farm. He actually did a presentation for us, field day for us, and spent the night. Had a lot of alone time with him, which was really good. During the 2017 farm show, David Brandt came and had a farm presentation for us and stayed at our house during the 2020, this past year's farm show. And then at that same time frame, we had David Kleinschmidt and Doug Peterson from Understanding Ag also had a film day on our farm show. So we've had a lot of good contact with some highly intelligent people that continually knock me left or right and try and keep me in line as to which way I should be going here. Another unique thing that we've done with a handful of area farmers is if we want to see Greg Judy, who's known for his grazing enterprises, we actually got several of us together and we contacted Greg and we bought him for a day. And by buying him for a day, we went to his farm early in the morning. We spent all day with him, no interruptions, and got to ask questions and walk his ground with him, look at his cattle and so forth with him, which was very beneficial. And then we also did the same thing with Alan Williams. We had Alan Williams up on one of the guys' farms with us, and we had him till everybody was done answering questions. It turns out it's not that expensive. You get a group of 8 or 10 of you together and you get a guy on your farm where you get to spend 8, 10, 12 hours with them, picking their minds. It's money well spent and time well spent.
Rick, thank you. And we'll have more questions for you in just a bit, but let's move from central Illinois to southern Illinois. Think in the Mount Vernon area in Jefferson County. We're going to talk a little bit with Mr. Seidel, who is there. Jerry, thank you for being with us. I appreciate you taking the time. You're in the southern part of the state of Illinois. Can you tell me a little bit about the operation there and what you've been up to?
Well, thanks, Todd. We're in not the far end of the state, but pretty far down and around Mount Vernon. It's kind of if you're ever on Interstate 57 or 64, it's about the last place to get a bite to eat or a sandwich if you're going out of state. I've been farming pretty well all my life, except when I was in college at U of I. And my family has been farming since, my ancestors arrived in the 1800s. We have about 1,200 acres. We grow corn, soybeans, wheat. And years ago, we used to have a lot of hogs. We've tried, I'll back up. We're no-till, never-till, probably 25 years in. There are exceptions. Sometimes you have ruts that you have to repair, but with a long-term no-till, you just don't have that many ruts. The ground's firm. We've experimented with cover crops probably 15 years. It's not like every acre of the farm's in covers, but we've tried different things. We've had some great failures alongside the road. That's part of it. We often will seed our covers with an airplane in the fall just because of labor considerations. And I like to get things started earlier. That has varying results, but if you put enough seed down, you'll probably get a stand. Kind of like Cade, cereal rye is probably our most reliable. The clovers and the legumes we have trouble with. Any little flat place, they'll drown out. And maybe someday we'll have stronger seeds for the wet feet. I like to plant green if I can, which means spraying right in front or right behind the planter, just within hours maybe if it can be done. I like ryegrass. Cereal rye is more reliable. Ryegrass has a deeper taproot. It's a lot harder to manage, harder to kill, but to me, it's kind of the gold standard in our soils. We have a lot of variation in our soils. A friend of mine, in fact, says, well, he's got 2 kinds of soil, 5 or 6 bag mix, and that's true for a lot of our hilltops and eroded slopes. We also have some flat prairie areas that aren't that bad, and all that can be in one field. You could have 5, 6 soil types in one field. So there's a lot of considerations in that regard. Annual ryegrass is good for us. We have a hard clay pan, and it'll break that up, and it'll even change your soil type given enough time. I've struggled trying to get it killed in a timely manner. My biggest mistake always is I wait too long to burn down my covers. They look so nice and they're growing so well. When you need to spray them, it's hard to pull the trigger on that. you get more biomass if you wait another week or so, but that usually leads to problems. And I would agree with Cade about the cereal rye. If you let it get too big, then it becomes kind of woody and it's not good for corn. But if you kill it young, it dissolves quickly during the growing season and releases the nutrients. In a perfect world, I'd grow probably clover or a legume in front of my corn. We've had plots that did not dry out that were really fantastic with the clover in front of corn. We've had, different successes and failures over the years. Slugs sometimes have been a problem, but I don't think they're too much worse than some of my conventional buddies. Sometimes they'll have slugs and I don't. Sometimes I do and they don't. But when they hit, they can be pretty rough. Mice can be a problem if you let that stuff grow too tall. The mice love to live in there, and they'll make some spots out in your field that look worse on the ground than they really are. But we're trying, we're always trying new things, and when you do that, you risk, some failures and yield reductions here and there, but also you get yield increases here and there. Our soils are especially droughty, and so I'm a drought. I was raised in the 70s, and we had some bad droughts in the early 80s too, and so I'm kind of programmed to defend our fields from drought. And I like a thick sod, a dead sod to plant into and soak up the rain during the growing season. It makes a big difference on yield on a dry year. Much of what I learned about covers, I learned from the people that were experimenting with it for the first time in my area, mainly Junior Upton and Terry Taylor, and they were guided by the late Mike Plummer with different plots and experiments. And I recognized this was going to be an incredible amount of work and management, and it is. It's like Terry Taylor says, this is the hardest thing you'll do probably in your farming career, is getting this cover crop balance just right. But it's worth doing. There's too much here to ignore. And I was reluctant at first. And no-till wasn't such a big deal. It was much easier for us than the cover crop management. But Junior Upton kept having field days at his farm. This was 20 years ago or more. And I would see what, he had corn roots going down into hard pan soils 5 feet deep. And I always left her thinking, we've got to make this work. This is just too good to pass up. And so I've been experimenting, trial and error, a lot of errors along the way. We've kind of settled into aerial spreading cereal rye on standing corn as it turns yellow. This would be late September for our area. And that'll give you a nice growth in the fall. And cereal rye will emerge in the spring and do pretty good too, but I would like some protection for the soil in the fall, because no-till is just not enough. You get open spaces and erosion, even in continuous no-till. You have to have something green on that soil. And there's a lot of benefits, like the other speakers have already said, and I don't want to cover that ground again, but water quality is a big part of this, and we kind of ignore that as farmers. We're thinking about yield and soils. I've been on our soil and water board for many years, and sometimes we forget that water part, but the public is, reminding us of the importance of the water quality, and they're going to force us to do something about it eventually if we can't get a grip on it voluntarily. And to me, the covers are the most obvious way to do that while still maintaining yield and profitability on the farm.
We'll take some questions for each of our panelists today. And if you want to add to this conversation, you can do that. Just put the questions into the chat box and we will pick them up and make sure that they get answered. Thank you to everyone who's been involved all morning long. I do have some questions. Since Jerry, you mentioned seeding into corn as it was about to turn yellow. There was a question about whether whether any of you have experimented with putting a cover crop in much earlier. They were talking maybe like the V5 stage. That would be well before tasseling. Anybody done
Well,
anything?
for our area, Mike Plummer did experiments with intercropping. In our area, there's just not enough steady moisture that the cover will sprout underneath the canopy of the corn and it'll die. For our area, I can't speak for everywhere else, but that doesn't work for us.
I know Mike had done a lot of work on that. Rick, you have something to add?
I just did a small trial 2 years ago with 60-inch rows, and I put them out in, it was early July I just broadcast them. Some of the seeds did better than others, obviously, if they needed a good soil contact, and the sun did some damage, but overall they grew pretty good. I didn't have the planter set up to get the population high enough on my 60-inch rows, so I had a short yield drag there. Just an experiment, something else I was trying.
Anything from far northern Illinois? Well, what I would consider far northern Illinois. I'm sure folks in Rockford probably would disagree with me.
I'm almost in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
So we have done a lot of aerial application, but I'm going to tell you that in a year like we had this year, if I had put out $30,000 worth of cover crop seed on 1,000 acres and had it applied, and it didn't come up because we had no fall rain, I would have been pretty sick to my stomach. As it was, we got a fair stand. I will take the late planted with the drill over the not coming up, is just kind of my observation. And I noticed somebody asked a question about having issues with pollen in cereal rye planting. And yes, and I know one of the people on the that is observing this actually had to come to the field with an air compressor and blow out the radiator of my tractor, and he actually stayed there in the field while I planted. And so the pollen can be an issue, but I'm sure that's from Jeffrey. So I have somebody who's stalking me.
Hey, Rick, what is in the 12-way mix for your wheat?
I've got, it's a lot similar to what Russell had earlier, but water peas, hairy vetch, rape, cereal rye, sorghum sudan, oats, triticale, crimson clover, millet, sunflowers, and then I always have leftover soybeans I throw in. Typically around 40 pounds an acre, a little more than that for a total plant rate. I think one of the main concerns there is you keep your brassica rates down to 2 pounds or less. I think if you get too many brassicas on, they grow so early and they'll shade a lot of this other stuff out with their big leaves.
How early can you plant it?
That's followed my wheat harvest. So
Right.
It's coming in. And I don't plant it immediately after my wheat's out. I give it a little bit of time because I don't want a lot of this stuff going to seed on me. So I'll let it sit for a week to 10 days, which typically puts me about approaching the third week of July when I plant that. And then, of course, we graze that in the fall and then follow that with corn in the spring. And one thing that I started, this is the first year that I tried it, but for my early spray, I'll plant and then I'll spray and I'll kill all my grasses. Anything that, cereal rye or anything like that, as it's just coming up, and I'll let any of the legumes that are growing, I'll continue to let them grow, and then they'll be able to contribute some nitrogen for a while yet, and then I'll take them out with my in-season application of nitrogen and post chemical.
Anybody experiment with winter kill cover crops? They talk about peas and oats, but other things besides that?
I've experiment. Go ahead.
No, I just say that the 12 May mix has both summer and winters.
Right.
And so I do get
Yeah, I
a
heard
certain
that.
amount of winter kill, and yeah.
And my experience has been with, we've done black oats and winter oats and yellow oats and experiment with them. And if they don't, I need a cover, as far north as I am, I need a cover crop that grows in the spring. Otherwise, I can't develop enough biomass.
Hey, Jerry, I'll address this one to you because this started in your part of the world, but moved northward through Illinois. Do you have much of a problem with soybean cyst nematode?
Yeah, we've had that for much longer than the rest of the state. When I was a kid, we had cyst nematode in the 70s. All the cover crops provide an advantage because they will, especially cereal rye and most especially annual ryegrass. And this is some more Mike Plummer's work. The cyst eggs will hatch out on those roots thinking that it's a host, and then they'll die. And so the longer you keep cover crops out there, it knocks down your soybean cyst nematode egg count significantly.
Anybody else have some thoughts as to control on cyst nematode and cover crops and the way you're doing your farms? We'll pass that one by in that case. A couple of other things.
Well, I'd add one more thing. Not all cover crops are equal. Some are actually hosts to nematodes, but the annual ryegrass and the cereal rye are the best for that problem.
Yeah. Cade, we have a question for you. They didn't quite understand why you only use rye. What are the primary problems with the other cover crops?
Well, it's not the problem with the cover crop, it's the timing. My harvest extends to some years the ground is frozen, so it's pretty hard to get any biomass growing in the fall. So I'm going to tell you the reason why we use cereal rye exclusively, almost exclusively, is because I can plant it, and if it doesn't come up in the fall, it'll come up in the spring, and I can develop reasonable biomass. It's way better than nothing, but it's not the beautiful thick covers that I would like to see, but it's way better than not doing it.
How many pounds of seed do each of you use? And Cade, we'll just work our way from you to the south.
Cereal rye, any place from 40 to 60 pounds, depending on the planting date, usually starting the light rates early and getting heavier as the season goes.
Rick?
I echo that, 40 to 60 pounds.
Anything different, Jerry?
Well, generally, if you're flying on covers, you want to double your seeding rate. So we're putting on like 100 pounds of cereal rye with an airplane. A lot of that will be lost, of course, but generally that gets a good stand. And it depends on the weather, like somebody mentioned. If it's bone dry and no rain in sight, I won't fly it on because it's a pretty chancy endeavor there. Same goes with cereal rye. I mean, with ryegrass, we can get by with like 10 or 12 pounds drilled, maybe 8. I'll double that if I'm flying it on.
There's another question. I don't know whether the three of you will have an answer to this, or maybe Rachel or Dennis from Extension might be able to join in on the conversation as it relates to any information on about regulations being considered for phosphorus and nitrogen. Usually I'm pretty up to speed on that. I don't recall hearing anything from the state or federal area, at least at this point. They're always in consideration, but hearing none, I think that's where we are. They're always in consideration, but I don't recall that there's anything moving at this time. Couple of questions here. Take us back, Cade, to when you first started. You did this, but what resources were most helpful for you?
Actually, the best resources I found were farmers that were attempting to do the same thing, because we're all willing to share information with each other and have been really good, the community that has been doing cover crops, because it's a steep learning curve. You have to remember that we all grew up with tillage as our background. So there were years and years of knowledge that were passed on by our parents or grandparents about how to do tillage. And when we switched to no-till and cover crops, we started a system that we were outside of our comfort zone, and we didn't have that knowledge base. So I extensively relied on some extension people, Towery, Plummer, you know, those guys were instrumental in helping me get going and encouraging me to stick with it. And I owe that to people coming behind me to give them the information and pass it on of what I can and can't do here. But I would recommend finding a neighbor that is doing something that you like and can work with and talk to. And that is without a doubt the best source of information.
Rick, how about for you?
Yeah, I agree with Kate. It's more of a farmer related enterprise than anything. There guys that are doing it are more than willing to help. You know, Junior Upton, Terry Taylor, that was one of my first aha moments being down on Junior's farm. David Brandt went out to his place in Ohio. That's an incredible place to visit. He's an incredible man to visit with. Dan Towery, he was instrumental in us getting started on this. But I do think you need to find somebody that you can call them up on the phone and not only learn about your mistakes, but laugh about your mistakes and know that he's not going to talk about you in a coffee shop and go from there.
Yeah. And Jerry, Cade mentioned that we all grew up with not no-tilling and with tillage, but I'm wondering in your part of the world where no-till was developed at Dixon Springs, and we still have actually the original planter that was developed from the research at the University of Illinois and Extension there. I'm wondering whether you actually do have tillage in your background or very much, or whether it was mostly no-till for you. And then, of course, the question about where do you learn from?
Well, I certainly had tillage in my background, and we started no-tilling when we started double cropping soybeans into wheat extensively in the early mid-70s. We learned from that we could do that in much easier environments besides wheat straw. And corn was a little bit more challenging, but as Cade explained with the starter on his planter, that erases all the problems you might have with your cover crop sucking up all the easy low-hanging fruit with nitrogen. And it's an essential part of a cover crop no-till corn system. And even if I went back to tillage, I would still put starter on. It makes such a difference. I was lucky that I'm not that far from Junior's farm and Terry Taylor's farm and near where Mike Plummer was based. And I kept going to those field days and kept thinking I just had to make this work. And I think all of us have to make this work because it's just too good to pass up. And in my part of the country, I've witnessed there's so many what we used to call old throwed-away places that were farmed with tillage and eroded down to just clay knobs, and they would hardly grow weeds. No-till changed those spots on our farm to where they grow crops, and you can't find them anymore. But cover crops are like the bride for no-till, and it's hard to think of one without the other anymore. In our area, we've got, well, we haven't been real active since the virus, but we have a group of farmers we roughly call a cover crop roundtable or no-till roundtable, and we meet at each other's farms usually once a year. And a lot of times that was centered around Junior's or Terry's operation, but it's gone to other places too. And we all talk about our successes and failures. You know, we're just a group of farmers from the area that are trying to make this work for us. And you learn a lot of things. And there's better people, better farmers on that than me. And one thing that's coming out now that seems to have a lot of promise is the roller crimper. I know a farmer that practically uses no herbicides. There may be one pass because he'll plant beans and cereal rye, roll it down, or maybe roll it down as he plants. I don't know what he's doing now, but you know, he gets by maybe just spraying it one time, and he's got his seeds planted in like a garden mulch of straw. And that not only holds the water, it suffocates weeds. It won't kill all the weeds, but it makes it a lot more manageable. And I borrowed one from one of our roundtable members in this spring, and it was a wonderful tool. And I'll probably be incorporating that concept into my operation in the future. But it's kind of a game-changing tool, and it needs, you know, to be focused on, I think.
That's a good question. What tool, Rick and Cade, and I'll start with you, Rick, would you not want to give up that you have and own and use on the farm?
Probably a better question would be, what tool would I like to get on a farm?
There you go. That's fine too.
Nobody wants to give anything up once you got it. You don't want to give it up. But I think that I think the roller crimper is just an incredible tool. It's just there's just so many possibilities with it. You know, you can plant your beans, you can crimp 10 days after, you can incorporate it with your planter and crimp it right ahead of the planter. And I've seen some planters set up like that, and it's amazing the seed bed that you end up with, and the plant job and the consistency. The first time I went to David Brandt's farm and I walked out in a cornfield that he had planted, the brace roots were actually below the mulch level. He had so much on the ground out there that the brace roots were underneath it. And I had a friend with me at the time, and we both just looked at each other, and well, I won't tell you what we said. Wouldn't be appropriate here, but it was an aha moment.
And Cade, for you?
Well, you know, everything revolves around the planter at my farm. So I would say, yeah, my planter is not set up. I cannot plant into tilled soil. Haven't tried for a long time. Maybe I should answer that. But, you know, the modifications to the planter are probably the toughest thing to give up. You know, I've put a lot of precision add-ons to it, and I think they're well worth the time and the money, and they've paid dividends.
How have each of your nutrient programs changed over time, and do less and or more of particular nutrients on? Cade?
Way less nitrogen. We're probably using 0.6 pounds of nitrogen per yield goal is what we're achieving now. Last year, this last crop, it was slightly less even in a dry year. P&K, we've gone to almost all in furrow. It's an expensive program, but the most expensive thing is the thing that you do and it doesn't work. So fertilizer on the planter is a big issue, and so all our fertilizers supplied, pretty much all of it's applied subsurface.
Rick, nutrient program?
Yeah, the nitrogen, we're right at the same level, 0.6 per bushel yield goal. We put 25% down as our first pass, nothing in the fall, and then as our post, we adjust to what the leaf tissue tests and other Haiti tests and so forth is telling us what we need. Kind of adjust to that, and we've cut back on the phosphates and the potash is pretty hard. You know, up to 50% in a lot of cases on that. And the soil tests are maintaining, the yields are maintaining, and I attribute a lot of that to the cover crops. They go down, and this was talked about earlier this morning, that they can release nutrients from the soil that the corn or the soybean plant aren't able to access, and they'll bring that up through the plant body to the top. They'll lay that on the surface, and then as that deteriorates, compost, whatever you want to call it, it's going to feed your soybean and your corn. So while we're reducing the chemicals that we apply, or not the chemicals, the nutrients that we apply, we are not reducing the nutrients that are actually available to the crop.
And Jerry, your
We
nutrient
haven't had a
plan?
significant reduction. I would say maybe in phosphorus we had a phosphorus buildup, and then also we're using some local turkey litter. Nitrogen in our part of the world, you need about 1.2 pounds per bushel. We've stayed about with that. We've shifted quite a bit of nitrogen to the starter fertilizer. That seems to get the corn off to a big jump. We didn't really notice that so much until we started using it, and you'll have a row that gets pinched off or quits for some reason, and it stands out like a sore thumb all season long. And we didn't know what we were missing, in fact. And so starter is a big part of that. I know Junior Upton, he gives his vetch crop about 70 pounds credit on his nitrogen that he doesn't have to buy for his corn. But I'm not up to his level yet of advancement.
We'll have one final question for you all. I want to know where you think the soil health on your farm will be in 5 to 10 years. And as we get to that, a reminder that came to me in our running conversation here is that some of the soil and water conservation districts do have roller crimpers available. So you might contact your local soil and water conservation district on those. So where, Cade, do you think the health of the soil on your farm will be in 5 to 10 years?
I'm still experimenting. And I think that's probably the most important message for everybody is to experiment, do it on small acreages, see what changes, what you can. Every farmer has different tolerances, and figure out what you can tolerate and what you can do on your own farm. Mine, I think with continued use of cover crops, build organic matter, build resiliency. Those are the things I'm really after. And farming a bigger percentage of my soil profile, because as you use cover crops, more and more of that soil profile becomes available to the crop that's your main crop, your money crop.
Rick, 5 to 10 years soil health?
It's going to improve, I hope. And I think some of the things that I can address more directly is the neonicotinoids on the soybeans. I think as your soil health and everything involved with soil health gets more in line as to where we know we can be, where we maybe hope we can get, there's not as many reasons to use that. Your fungicides, your insecticides, you get your bricks content up. Healthier soil leads to healthier plants. The fungicides may not be as necessary, but I think a takeaway that I had from, and I'm not sure when I actually realized this, but I kept seeing what all these other guys were doing, and I'd bring bits and pieces of it home and try to adopt it on my farm. And that's good, but I think you have to not adopt what somebody else is doing, but adapt to what your situation is and apply that towards your goals in your future.
And finally, Jerry, please.
Well, I expect things to get better, and my tilth and organic matter to increase. One thing that happens in our area that's different maybe than others is our organic matter, and this is nothing Mike Plummer figured out through research, is our organic matter will about peak out at 3, and then instead of going higher, the organic matter goes deeper. So you increase basically your topsoil. I've seen it in soil plots that at Terry Taylor's farm, where the dark organic layer just gets deeper and deeper over time. And there's all kinds of benefits to that, of course. I also think in the future we'll have better varieties of legumes in particular that can withstand wetter conditions throughout the fall and winter, when a lot of that stuff will drown out. A lot of things happen by accident. And one thing I've noticed on my farm that may be something a seed breeder can figure out in the future is a perennial cover crop. Well, I should say it perennial reseeds itself. We have a a root, or we have a weed on our farm called, we loosely call it cheat. There's several different species, but I think downy brome is the worst offender. And it establishes a niche on continuous never-till, no-till fields. And it's kind of a problem weed, but I've come to embrace it on 100-acre field I have, because it will reseed itself as the soybeans are ripening. And by the time, say, November is here, it's already has a nice little sod established, and it will hold the soil through the winter. It doesn't have great deep roots or, nitrogen fixing qualities or anything, but I never have to plant a cover crop on that field. It's already covered at harvest time mostly. And the grass, it's a grass, so it breaks that, rotation. So you can plant soybeans over and over out there without a significant yield loss, because the soil thinks it's already had the grass on it, which it did. But it reseeds itself. It starts early in the fall. And if we could get a cover crop species like that with better rooting qualities and maybe some others, I think we'd really have something and we'd get better adoption. This is a hard proposition, cover crops. And I'm always, as a member of our Soil and Water Board, trying to think of ways to get people to adopt it. And you can a lot of times get somebody to try it on the 40 or 20 acres, and then one of the many pitfalls will happen to them and they'll say, I'll never do that again. So we've got to avoid that. And cereal rye is probably a good place to start. It's harder to fail with it. But I just see better things in the future. I still think we're in the beginning phases of this. And, in a generation or two, who knows how good it could be.
Well, thank you, all three of you. We appreciate that. Jerry Seidel in Jefferson County, Illinois, in the southern part of the state. From Logan County in the central part of the state, of course, Rick Kaesebier, and Cade Bushnell in Ogle County, all farmers. We appreciate you taking the time with us and spending it with us today. We're wrapping up now our conservation cropping seminar. We do have a message from our sponsors. We'll get to that in a moment. While the sponsors message is running, do look in the chat box. There is an evaluation link there, and there's a QR code that will pop up at the end of our program after our sponsors that you'll want to visit, and that'll give you the ability to get some CEUs, some continuing education units if you need them. Thanks to all. And now here's a word from our sponsors.
This is Paige Buck, Communications Specialist with the Illinois Nrcs. Thank you to everyone who joined us today and all of our wonderful presenters. The Nrcs, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, has been involved in these seminars since the start. And frankly, everything discussed today, whether by the technical specialists or farmers, is what our agency, NRCS, has been talking about and doing and teaching for the last 85 years. NRCS has people right where you are in every county, so we're there to work one-on-one with you. We offer technical help and financial help because sometimes you need one, sometimes you need both. We will come out to your farm and your land and look at your situation and customize solutions. So whether you need ideas or guidance or options, or maybe detailed engineering designs for some conservation structure, NRCS can deliver. We are a partner farmers can trust, and we were glad to be part of this today. Thanks.
I'm Michael Woods, manager of the Division of Natural Resources that houses the Bureau of Land and Water Resources and the Bureau of Environmental Programs within the Illinois Department of Agriculture. For 150 years, the Illinois Department of Agriculture has been an advocate for Illinois' agricultural industry and provides the necessary regulatory functions to benefit consumers, agricultural industry, and our natural resources. The department's vision is to promote and regulate agriculture in a manner which encourages farming and agribusiness while protecting Illinois' consumers and our natural resources. Our belief in the division of natural resources is that agricultural sustainability rests on the principle that we must meet the needs of our present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs.
Hi, I'm Kim Biggs, Public Information Officer with the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. The Illinois EPA would like to thank today's attendees for participating in this year's Conservation Cropping Seminar. We support the adoption of in-field conservation practices such as nutrient management, reduced tillage, and cover crops, which all work to improve our state's water quality and soil health. The Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy has a long-term goal of reducing nutrient loss by 45%. Meeting this goal will require large-scale adoption of both in-field conservation practices as well as edge-of-field practices such as filter strips, wetlands, bioreactors, and saturated buffers. Through our Section 319 grant program, Illinois EPA offers up to 60% cost share for the development of watershed-based plans and voluntary implementation of conservation practices. We encourage you to participate in your local watershed groups and through the implementation of these important conservation practices.
I'm University of Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason. As you know, thank you for being with us today. On behalf of Extension, I'd like to make sure that you visit our websites and talk with your local Extension professionals about conservation, cropping, cover crops. We do things with the commercial ag folks that are located in the field and, of course, on campus as well. And our Department of Crop Sciences, as well as in agricultural economics. We're so glad to help you out with all the questions that you might have, and all you have to do is to call your local extension office. One last final note from me, please do make sure that you check out that QR code at the end and that you fill out the evaluation.
Hello, I'm Grant Hammer, the Executive Director for the Association of Illinois Soil and Water Conservation Districts. We here at the association hope that you find the 2022 CCS events resourceful. Speaking of resourceful, soil and water conservation districts are a great resource to producers or landowners seeking to incorporate more conservation into their farming practices or on their land. For more than 75 years, soil and water conservation districts of Illinois have developed a trusted reputation amongst farmers and landowners across the state. Please visit the State Association for Soil and Water Conservation at www.aiswcd.org or look us up on Facebook or Twitter to connect with your local district. Clean water, healthy soils.
I'm Erin Gundy, the Champaign County Soil and Water Conservation District's Resource Conservationist. The CCSWCD is committed to protecting and enhancing soil and water, wildlife habitat, and Champaign County's quality of life by implementing various projects, participating in collaborative partnerships, and providing technical and financial assistance for conservation. One major project delivered by the CCSWCD in partnership with conservation groups, other SWCDs, and stakeholders is the Saving Tomorrow's Agriculture Resources STAR initiative. The goal of STAR is to encourage the continued adoption of conservation practices, provide resources and roadmaps for improvement, and recognize farmers for their commitment to building soil health and reducing nutrient loss. Visit STAR and CCSWCD websites for more information about the district and STAR.
I'm Allelopathy with American Farmland Trust. American Farmland Trust is a national nonprofit and the leader of the No Farms, No Food movement. Our mission is to protect farmland, promote sound farming practices, and keep farmers on the land. We've protected over 6.5 million acres of farmland and ranchland using agriculture conservation easements. In the Midwest, we work with farmers, landowners, and conservation partners to improve the health of our soils and the quality of water through a variety of programs and policy advocacy. In addition to working with farmers and landowners, we also support the implementation of conservation by quantifying outcomes of soil health practices to prove they work through various research reports and case studies. In the Midwest, we need to save the land, not just by the acre, but also by the inch. To learn more, visit www.farmland.org or get in touch by emailing us at midwest@farmland.org.
Illinois Stewardship Alliance lead organizer Liz Ruppel here to share more about how our statewide nonprofit organization brings farmers and eaters together to solve problems in the food and farm system. A lot of times, solving problems looks like shifting policy. We work really hard and find a lot of joy in communicating with farmers across Illinois to talk about their issues that matter to them and how we can help. Farmers are invited to join our local food farmer caucus and soil health farmer caucus to help us prioritize our agenda for the year and advocate on issues ranging from soil health and nutrient pollution to growing the local food system. The Soil Health Farmer Caucus actually just submitted their first resolution this year that would declare a Soil Health Day and Week celebration in Illinois. The Soil Health Week will take place March 7th through the 11th, and if you'd like to learn more about this week-long event, check out the event page in the chat. Want to learn more about what we do and what we have going on? Visit www.ilstewards.org. And if you're a farmer, please check out our Soil Health Farmer Caucus page and Local Food Farmer Caucus page to learn how you can get involved in the work.
Hi everyone, I'm Jean Brokish, coordinator for the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership, or ISAP, a coalition of 13 organizations working together to increase the adoption of practices that support healthy soil, clean water, and profitable farms. ISAP's programs are centered on helping Illinois agriculture meet the goals of the nutrient loss reduction strategy and the use of conservation cropping systems to mitigate production risks and promote climate resiliency. Field days, webinars, and networking events are held throughout the year, and cover crop calls are held monthly. ISAP also hosts in-depth trainings, including the Advanced Soil Health Training and Advanced Conservation Drainage Training. Learn more about ISAP's programs by visiting our website, where you can access fact sheets, gain insights into ecosystem markets, find a soil health specialist, subscribe to The Aggregate, our monthly e-newsletter, and reserve the rainfall simulator for your next field day. Visit ilsustainableag.org.
This is Doug Hansen with Pro Harvest Seeds. Pro Harvest is an independent seed company out of Ashcombe, Illinois. We have our own brand of corn, wheat, and soybeans, and we also specialize in forages and cover crops. With the forages and cover crops, we like to work on 3 to 5 year plans with our growers on each field so that we can maximize opportunities for the goals of the field. When it comes to cover crops, whether we're looking to help with weed suppression, scavenge nutrients, alleviate compaction, decrease erosion, or improve permeabilities of the soils, or whatever the goals may be, Pro Harvest can help you by getting the right corn-soybean combination and then looking at what cover crop blend or cover crop attributes can be utilized to accomplish those goals.
Please hover your mobile device camera over the QR code on the screen. The app should automatically sign you in. If you are having trouble accessing this app, please follow the Google form link in the chat to submit your CCA numbers or go directly to the website. Also, be sure to fill out the evaluation form also in the chat.